Hey guys, so during medieval times a woman's climax was sometimes actually viewed as a valid medical remedy. When women expressed weariness, moodiness or, excessive fantasizing, they weren't comforted, but instead brought to monasteries to drive out demonic forces. Yet what transpired within those private spaces is startling. Where did therapy end and cruelty begin? Who held permission to intervene? And who was compelled to remain silent and submit? This evening, we step back into the medieval era, where passion was dreaded and healing took an uncomfortably personal shape. So before you settle in, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate the content I create here. Also, drop a comment letting me know your location and what time it is where you are. It's always intriguing to discover who's watching from different parts of the globe. Now lower the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that calming ambient sound. And let's begin this exploration together this evening. When a medieval woman started shaking, gasping for air, or releasing sounds that seemed involuntary, the reasoning was seldom considered normal. Through the lens of clergymen and believers, such responses indicated that her physical form had been seized by malevolent entities. This perspective influenced how women's wellness was interpreted, and it established the basis for ceremonies designed to purify instead of cure. The link between bodily satisfaction and spiritual peril was made without doubt, and therefore every apparent indication of enjoyment was reinterpreted as confirmation of demonic influence. Households delivered their girls and spouses to the cathedral with anxiety instead of reassurance, believing that what they witnessed wasn't a standard bodily process, but Satan's doing. The clergymen, for their part, didn't dispute this anxiety. They welcomed it, because it strengthened their position as protectors of virtue and authority. Within shadowed spaces, ceremonies took place. A woman deemed to be under spirit control would be positioned in a chamber with faint lighting and dense incense clouds. Flames wavered while the atmosphere became thick with resin and botanicals. The clergyman would recite invocations, his speech constructing a shield against what he insisted was demonic invasion. Accompanying these recitations came physical interventions. Fabric saturated in heated oils was applied to the body. Palms travelled over the stomach, legs and torso under the pretense of spiritual cleansing. Every shudder, every scream was presented as evidence that the ceremony was succeeding. When the physique ultimately discharged its strain, the interpretation wasn't comfort from distress or an organic response, but instead the exit of a corrupting entity. It seems nearly ridiculous that something as straightforward as a bodily contraction could be characterized as triumph over demons. Still, this was the reasoning that directed whole societies. The conclusion often brought a feeling of tranquility. Women described sensing unburdened, their respiration more regular, their sleep more profound. Yet the understanding wasn't theirs to determine. The clergyman would announce the procedure successful, proclaiming that the wickedness had been expelled. Households departed, convinced their relative had been restored through holy intervention, never recognizing that what had transpired was an ordinary bodily mechanism, misidentified as a divine struggle. To suggest differently was inconceivable, for to challenge the interpretation was to face possible accusation of blasphemy. The standing of these ceremonies expanded. Townspeople murmured about young women who had been liberated from sinister powers. Following evenings of trembling before clergymen, accounts travelled through settlements, strengthening the conviction that the cathedral exclusively could manage such disturbances. Dread and confidence merged into submission. Women couldn't openly acknowledge what they experienced during these incidents, nor could they pose questions. For them, remaining quiet meant remaining safe. If we consider it through contemporary understanding, it would resemble entering a medical facility only to discover that every sign, from a sneeze to a fractured bone, was regarded as evidence of demonic presence and addressed through prayer and ceremonial contact. The irrationality is obvious, yet in that period it was standard. The The societal burden of these customs can't be underestimated. Women became targets of observation. Their bodies watched for indicators of abnormality and a breath. A collapse or a troubled evening could all provide reason for doubt. Mothers cautioned their girls not to attract notice, and spouses informed on their wives for behaving oddly. The pattern reinforced itself because it validated the supremacy of religious control. The feminine form wasn't hers to possess. It was a container to be examined, adjusted, and dominated. Within monasteries, identical anxieties influenced practices. Young women who mentioned visions or who seemed agitated during nighttime were brought into isolated chambers. Sisters performed gentler variations of identical ceremonies, employing warmed fabrics, botanical soaks, and soft invocations. What occurred beyond those boundaries stayed unmentioned, yet the design was evident. Comfort arrived not from comprehending the physique, but from surrendering it to methods wrapped in holiness. I can't avoid feeling troubled picturing how many women confused regular bodily feelings for a hex, because that was the sole interpretation provided to them. The surroundings itself contributed to maintaining conviction. Stone rooms resonated with chanting. The heavy atmosphere of incense weighed against the body, and the absence of illumination confused perception. In that environment, bodily responses could be characterized as otherworldly without opposition. The commonplace became exceptional merely by altering the narrative told about it. Nobody risked suggesting that what appeared like salvation was actually a physical discharge unconnected to entities. These ceremonies also fulfilled a functional role for the cathedral. By designating bodily satisfaction as wicked, clergymen preserved control over both women's wellness and morality. Households grew reliant on them for answers, and reliance generated authority. The more puzzling the response, the more power the clergyman asserted. The less women grasped their own bodies, the more they were connected to the organization that decoded their every tremor. It was a pattern that sustained itself with each frightened household and each quieted woman. For the women themselves, the encounter was complicated. Some departed sensing genuinely unburdened, persuaded that they had been rescued from darkness. Others bore humiliation, told to confess and repent, permitting their bodies to be exposed. A handful came back repeatedly, not completely certain whether they were sick, hexed, or merely pursuing instances of discharge that could never be spoken of aloud. Their personal bewilderment stayed concealed beneath layers of teaching and dread. This bewilderment wasn't random, it was nurtured. By characterizing satisfaction as demonic presence and spiritual cleansing as restoration, the cathedral ensured that understanding of the physique stayed unreachable. Women existed under the threat of doubt, constrained by ceremonies they didn't select. Lifetimes developed without language to articulate their own feelings. The quietness became custom, and custom became reality. The concept that satisfaction was proof of Satan may appear absurd now, yet it demonstrates how profoundly domination was integrated into everyday existence. What should have been recognized as normal was recharacterized as abnormal. What could have been clarified became prohibited. This inheritance would influence how women were handled not solely in medieval times, but in the eras that came after. The custom of designating bodily responses as demonic influence converted the most private aspects of existence into tools of dread. Women were deprived of control, clergymen were raised in power, and societies were fastened tightly to the cathedral. The outcome was a civilization that confused ignorance for morality and superstition for medicine. Ultimately, the shaking of women in flame-lit chambers reveals less about entities and more about domination. It demonstrates how delicate understanding can be when information is withheld, and how readily dread can be employed to influence the most intimate dimensions of existence. The conviction that satisfaction was a sign of wickedness characterized this period. Clergymen executed their ceremonies with assurance. Households believed in the method, and women carried the burden of misunderstanding. Comfort was discovered, yet its significance was twisted, leaving behind an inheritance of domination. The story of demonic influence and spiritual cleansing was the initial layer in a much broader design. Shortly, new interpretations appeared, ones that looked scientific yet contained identical mistakes. These novel concepts didn't substitute the ancient anxieties, but constructed upon them, generating more complex rationalizations for what was never genuinely comprehended. And within those interpretations existed an even more peculiar conviction about the wandering of the uterus. The concept that the uterus could drift within a woman's physique was among the most enduring fallacies of medieval times. It was thought that the womb, instead of being secured in position, was able to travel from one section of the body to another, compressing against the lungs, the heart, or the stomach. If a woman mentioned difficulty breathing, unexpected fainting, or odd episodes of feeling, it was claimed that her uterus had drifted from its place. This hypothesis was echoed in sermons, transcribed into documents, and instructed by healers who had minimal opportunity to examine anatomy and actuality. It evolved into a practical interpretation for virtually every variety of affliction that women encountered, particularly those that couldn't be readily quantified or comprehended. Because this conviction was so prevalent, therapies emerged that were intended to encourage the uterus back into its correct position. Heated compresses were positioned on the stomach, aromatic oils were massaged into the body, and substantial force was exerted to the pelvis. Some practitioners even suggested forceful rubbing or pressing of the lower abdomen, certain that this would compel the uterus to return. Women experiencing these therapies frequently trembled, inhaled sharply, or screamed, and such responses were interpreted as confirmation that the drifting organ had been corrected. It's almost comical that educated men of that time persuaded themselves they were directing an organ back into position when, in reality, they were merely triggering natural bodily reactions. Another technique employed to address the drifting uterus involved controlling aromas. Healers thought that the uterus could be pushed away from offensive smells and attracted toward agreeable ones. Harsh botanicals or smouldering resins were positioned beneath the nostrils, supposedly forcing the uterus from the upper physique. Simultaneously, blossoms or scented oils were rubbed between the thighs, intended to draw the organ downward. The woman herself was seldom offered a voice in these ceremonies, and her physical reactions were understood not as indicators of pain, but as proof of effectiveness. To express it in current language, it would be as if physicians now insisted that migraines were triggered by your heart moving into your cranium and recommended incense to push it back down. In numerous situations, the physical manipulations resulted in outcomes that nobody would recognize openly. The compressing, massaging, and vibrations administered to the lower physique occasionally triggered involuntary discharge similar to sexual peak. Women who underwent this weren't informed that it was a natural reaction. Rather, the response was characterized as additional confirmation that the uterus had been repositioned. The medical practitioners could persist in their practice without confessing that what they observed was unrelated to their hypothesis. The women themselves were left in bewilderment, incapable of naming what had occurred or to discuss it without danger of humiliation. Quietness was promoted and ignorance was maintained. Understanding of the physique stayed concealed, substituted by superstition echoed as truth. Women were dissuaded from challenging the interpretations presented to them. Households, persuaded that they were assisting, brought their girls and spouses for therapy. Whenever unusual symptoms emerged, the pattern persisted because it served the goals of those in authority. If the uterus was enigmatic and threatening, then healers and clergymen retained domination over the enigma. The locations of these therapies reinforced their power. Poorly illuminated chambers filled with smoke and incense made the ceremony seem solemn. The noise of invocations or chanting resonated off stone barriers, persuading households that the methods were sacred instead of experimental. Women rested quietly on timber benches, vulnerable to the contact of others under the assertion of restoration. The pain they experienced was concealed beneath layers of ceremony and understanding. I find it disturbing to consider how many women must have endured bewilderment and even humiliation simply because they relied on the power of men who insisted they understood their bodies. The hypothesis of the drifting uterus also shaped social perspectives. If a woman was melancholy, worried, or resistant, her conduct could be rejected as the consequence of her restless womb. Emotional difficulties were not addressed with empathy but identified as signs of a condition. This made it simpler to dominate women since their statements and emotions were stripped of validity. The assessment was both medical and ethical, assigning fault on the physique instead of on the surroundings or the situations of their existence. Medical writings of the period transmitted the mistake forward. Scribes reproduced illustrations that portrayed the uterus as an organ capable of displacement. These documents were examined by young pupils who subsequently became healers, guaranteeing that the falsehood continued. Without dissection or adequate anatomical examination, there was no chance to rectify the error. The absence of understanding left room for speculation, and speculation was influenced by dread and domination. Even when results of therapy were favourable, the interpretations stayed incorrect. Comfort frequently arrived because the physique had been massaged, calmed with warmth, or distracted by aromas. Rather than acknowledging these straightforward effects, practitioners maintained that the uterus had been restored. The reality was less significant than preserving power. For women, the consequence was a combination of authentic comfort and continuing ignorance. They felt improved, yet never understood why, and so they came back again when signs reappeared. The continuation of this conviction demonstrates how fragile understanding was in medieval times. One mistake, echoed across lifetimes, came accepted as an unshakable reality. The price of this mistake fell most severely on women who endured the therapies, the humiliation, and the quietness. They were converted into passive recipients of ceremonies that insisted to restore but frequently served to dominate. The falsehood of the drifting uterus persisted because it reinforced existing frameworks of authority. It permitted men to assert power over women's bodies while concealing their own absence of comprehension. The inheritance of this hypothesis extended far past the therapies themselves. It influenced how women were perceived, how their suffering was evaluated, and how their statements were rejected. When society connected wellness to a fabricated illness, it discovered an easy method to dismiss women's pain while ignoring its true origins. Lack of resources, insufficient nutrition, and everyday struggles were pushed aside for a fiction that placed responsibility on the flesh alone. Ultimately, the roaming uterus wasn't simply a clinical error. It served as a social mechanism deployed to sustain ignorance and reliance. Women existed beneath its influence for generations, subjected to interventions that misread their circumstances and stripped them of access to understanding. The notion of an internal organ drifting freely throughout the frame appears ridiculous now, but during that era it held genuine influence, moulding both healthcare and civilization. The roaming uterus was accepted as reality, not fiction. Women underwent ceremonies intended to fix what required no fixing, and practitioners declared success against a condition that was never present. Comfort was genuine, but its significance was distorted, keeping women bewildered and voiceless. The fiction showed how simply truth could be supplanted by command. It illustrated how myth could overpower reason and how anxiety could control healing practices. It created an extensive record of confusion that would resonate through subsequent eras. The uterus never roamed, yet the notion of its movement influenced numerous practitioners and muted numerous speakers. This deception moulded women's experiences in irreversible ways. The conviction in the roaming uterus prepared the ground for wider errors. Before long, virtually every ailment, from head pain to inability to rest, would be collected beneath a single broad term that portrayed women as illogical and unbalanced. That term became identified as feminine hysteria, and its effects were far more destructive. Women during medieval times carried a designation that stripped away the significance of their distress. Whatever discomfort they mentioned, from aching heads to wakeful hours to emotions of melancholy, was rapidly consolidated under a single name. Doctors and clergy named it feminine hysteria. This expression served as a convenient response to complicated circumstances, a method to dismiss suffering without genuinely examining it. The verdict wasn't a thorough examination of signs, but a condemnation delivered upon women directly. Through this approach, nearly every ailment transformed into evidence of imbalance, trapping women within a pattern of misinterpretation. The verdict was expansive and reckless. When a woman lost consciousness, she was declared afflicted. When she mentioned abdominal discomfort, the explanation remained identical. Weeping, rage, or even laughter could be read as dysfunction. This framework allowed no space for personal difference, no acknowledgement that each woman's situation might possess its distinct origin. Rather, all distress was reduced to a single designation. It seems almost absurd that whole societies embraced this solitary interpretation, as though women were incapable of experiencing any ailment beyond hysteria. Interventions were guided by the assumption that something toxic was contained within the frame and required expulsion. Women were instructed to gasp deeply, wail aloud, or exhaust themselves until depleted. Some were jolted, some were massaged with ointments, and some were compelled to yell or thrash violently until their frames gave out. Following this, the stillness that emerged was read as restoration. What frequently happened was a discharge resembling climax, though this was never recognized openly. As a comparison, it's like addressing contemporary individuals with sadness by confining them in a space and insisting they shriek until they lose awareness, then declaring them healed because they fell silent later. The environments were seldom intimate. Women were positioned before witnesses, occasionally relatives, occasionally religious authorities, and their responses were monitored intently. Every breath, every sound turned into proof of recovery. The women had no authority over how their frames were understood. They were informed that their distress had been extracted, that their conduct demonstrated the intervention's value. Quietness following was measured as compliance. These interventions created wounds deeper than any they resolved. Women started concealing their suffering, terrified of being labelled hysterical. Mentions of weariness or sorrow were kept hidden. Through suppressing their expressions, they escaped shame but simultaneously denied themselves opportunity for genuine assistance. The pattern fed itself. The less women voiced concerns, the more the hysteria designation appeared justified. The quietness transformed into validation of effectiveness, when truly it was validation of terror. The designation itself held power extending past healthcare. Spouses employed it to ignore their partners. Clergy wielded it to enforce submission. Neighbourhoods murmured it to disgrace those who differed. After being marked as unbalanced, a woman forfeited reliability across all areas. Her account in everyday matters could be challenged, her autonomy scrutinised, and her distress rejected. I can't avoid feeling troubled, picturing how sorrow, starvation, or worry could be converted into charges of imbalance simply because it proved more convenient than paying attention. Clinical writings strengthened the framework. Documents gathered numerous signs beneath a single category, communicating with confidence while providing no genuine comprehension. Pupils committed these errors to memory and transmitted them onward, guaranteeing the designation endured through successive generations. In the absence of rigorous examination of the frame, myth occupied the emptiness. The outcome was a clinical tradition that constructed itself not upon proof, but upon echo of identical error. Within households, the consequences were severe. Women swallowed their suffering instead of risking revelation. Relatives promoted quietness, considering it safeguarding. Young ones matured, observing their mothers and siblings conceal their distress, discovering early that expressing complaint brought danger. The pattern of terror persisted. upheld by a framework that assured structure but produced ignorance. The recognition of bodily discharge as indication of restoration introduced bewilderment. Women who underwent such responses throughout intervention were informed they had released toxin or malevolence. The actual significance of their frame's reactions remained concealed. Understanding was refused and ignorance was imposed. Comfort was interpreted not as ordinary but as divine. This guaranteed that women stayed reliant on practitioners who asserted command over their frames. The hysteria designation mirrored the broader civilization. It proved convenient, straightforward, and defensive of command. Through reducing all feminine distress to one explanation, civilization dodged addressing lack of resources, starvation, mistreatment, and sorrow. These actual problems stayed invisible beneath the shadow of hysteria. The remedy stayed constant, and therefore nothing truly changed. Relatives trusted in restoration, yet return was frequent, and the pattern restarted. This method reveals much regarding the period. It wasn't reason that moulded healthcare, but anxiety and myth. It wasn't restoration that drove interventions, but the maintenance of structure. Women remained voiceless, their suffering converted into performance, their frames exhausted beneath ceremonies that resolved nothing. Feminine hysteria wasn't only a clinical error, but simultaneously a social tool. The account of this designation demonstrates how misinterpretation can serve to preserve command. Women were muted, their individuality eliminated, and their wellness reduced to fiction. The comfort they occasionally experienced was genuine, but its significance was corrupted, buried beneath assertions of purification and remedy. The inheritance of that framework persisted for generations, influencing how women's suffering continued being rejected long past the medieval period had ended. The sweeping designation of feminine hysteria guaranteed that no sign received genuine comprehension. It kept women reliant, societies deceived, and healthcare stagnant. It represented a framework that prized submission over truth, quietness over understanding, and command over assistance. The verdict of hysteria established the foundation for additional practices. Before long, birth attendants and helpers would employ methods of their design, frequently providing comfort through capable contact, though they similarly declined to identify what they were performing. These discrete actions initiated another phase, one where understanding transferred through murmurs instead of through volumes, and concealment characterized how women tended to each other. Birth attendants during medieval times held a role unlike any alternative. They weren't clergy, neither were they officially educated doctors. Still, their understanding of women's frames ran deeper than either. They were summoned throughout delivery, throughout pregnancy losses, and when women reported ongoing discomfort and disturbed sleep. They possessed cures that had been transmitted from one generation to the following, not through volumes, but through application and attentive observation. Their command originated not from scholarly writings or the approval of the institution, but from the confidence of the women they assisted. This confidence provided them entry to instances of exposure, where their contact and their combinations of plants delivered comfort. What they performed in those instances frequently extended past what was articulated openly. When women experienced strain in the lower torso or weight in the upper legs, the birth attendants mixed ointments. These were mixtures of rosemary, thyme, or sage, soaked in animal fats or worked into salves. The midwives would heat the blend carefully before spreading it. With gentle, measured movements, they rubbed the abdomen, the hips, and the inner thighs. The women receiving their attention often felt their bodies soften, breathing became fuller, tension melted away, and at times their bodies trembled with contractions that neither the women nor the midwives acknowledged. It's remarkable how something as simple as deliberate touch was presented as spiritual purification, while the actual nature of the response was silently overlooked. These responses were not accidental. The techniques employed by midwives had been perfected through years of practice. Certain pressures worked deeply into the lower abdomen, while others traced paths down the thighs. The purpose, as shared in hushed tones, was to guide the womb back to ease or to expel captured wind. But underneath the explanation lay a straightforward reality. Women underwent a release that settled them entirely. Following such sessions, many drifted into profound rest, emerging later with brighter expressions and calmer minds. Relatives observing from beyond the door often assumed a divine act had occurred. Discretion was crucial. Midwives were already regarded with doubt, accepted only because their skills were vital for delivering children. To acknowledge openly that their techniques produced pleasure would have invited peril. It could be reframed as evidence of transgression, sorcery, or ethical decay. For this reason, they refrained from describing what they performed. They discussed instead adjusting bodily fluids, comforting wombs, or purifying essences. To picture this now, it would be like medical staff delivering effective treatments, but being compelled to label them ceremonies of sanctification rather than acknowledge they brought bodily comfort. The women who went through these appointments held contradictory emotions. They understood the solace was genuine. They felt steadier, more composed and capable of resuming everyday responsibilities. Yet they also bore the quiet demanded of them. To discuss what they experienced invited humiliation or threat. For most, the wisest choice was appreciation without elaboration. They came back to the midwives when similar anxieties surfaced, once more depending on their skill but never speaking the reality. This tradition of concealed wisdom became woven into women's existence. Mothers murmured to daughters about which plants to gather, the preparations to create, and the techniques that delivered relief. Guidance was exchanged in kitchens, gardens, and birthing rooms, never recorded in manuscripts. The continuation of this wisdom relied on remaining unspoken. Direct language could invite punishment, but quietness permitted it to persist. I cannot help but feel profound admiration for how women succeeded in maintaining such knowledge despite the threats surrounding them at every turn. The difference between this and the methods provided by clergy and doctors was striking. Where men employed ceremony and power, midwives employed contact and compassion. Where clergy portrayed distress as demonic influence, midwives treated it as strain. Women placed confidence in them because they understood their reality. They witnessed the outcomes not in incantations or assumptions, but in the restoration of rest and the reduction of discomfort, despite the dangers. Heated plants, uneven preparations, the midwives' efforts remained gentler than the draining ceremonies of the institution. Within homes or modest spaces, the work became familiar. A woman would recline on a mattress or a timber surface, the midwife readying oils nearby. The scent of plants saturated the space. The contact was confident yet continuous, concentrated on places that no clergyman or doctor dared to recognize. The hush in the space was profound, but it also served as shelter. The woman might shudder, exhale sharply, or discharge strain she couldn't articulate, and following that she would lie still. When she emerged from sleep, she felt restored, and that by itself was sufficient grounds for faith. These methods show how much reality can exist apart from authorized narratives. The midwives produced minimal documentation, yet their approaches influenced innumerable existences. What they understood was maintained not on pages, but through practice, through unspoken gestures of attention that communicated more powerfully than proclamations. In their care, women discovered ease in a society that refused them comprehension. The inheritance of the midwives is one of endurance. Their wisdom resisted elimination, not through defiance but through flexibility. They dressed their approaches in acceptable language, guarded their understanding closely, and guaranteed that comfort stayed accessible even when it couldn't be articulated. Their labour reminds us that understanding is not always preserved in volumes. Sometimes it exists in touch, in movements, and in the bond between women who must safeguard one another. The account of these practitioners demonstrates how the past can be divided into two levels. The visible was dominated by myth, dominance, and mistake. Underneath there was method, informed by observation, protected by tradition, yet rooted in fact. This concealed level gave women a delicate but essential form of agency. The labour of the midwives was not defiance, but requirement. They delivered attention where established medicine disappointed, and they provided comfort that couldn't be voiced. Their quietness shielded them, but it also buried the facts. For the women who visited them, what counted was not the terminology, but the result. A frame eased, a mind settled, and the capacity to persist. The picture that endures is one of women resting silently in confined quarters, the atmosphere heavy with plants, their frames shaking under attentive touch and then settling in complete stillness. Surrounding them, a reality of myth and dominance persisted. But inside those intervals, there was authentic care. The silent labour of midwives established a concealed passage in the chronicle of women's well-being. It maintained wisdom that men in positions rejected, and it provided ease. Where ceremonies of terror dominated, comfort was discovered, though its significance was never stated. This passage of silence transitions naturally into another, where ceremonies of purification moved into monastery chambers. There, young women were given treatments, disguised as sacred practice, where the identical techniques were recast as expressions of spiritual cleanliness. And in those isolated chambers, discretion achieved an even greater intensity. Monasteries in the Middle Ages were not merely locations of worship and dedication, but also silent centres of attention for women whose conduct concerned their relatives. When a young girl was sleepless through nights, described unusual visions, or appeared overtaken by worries, she was frequently brought to the monastery for discipline. Within granite barriers and massive timber entrances, ceremonies were conducted that merged elements of healing with the weight of faith. The formal description was sanctification, a washing of the essence through sacred methods. Yet what transpired inside those sealed rooms resembled hidden procedures more than expressions of piety. The nuns themselves became attendants who combined worship with contact, executing processes that no one beyond was intended to observe. The procedures started with the arrangement of the chamber. Shutters were closed, flames ignited, and plants positioned to smoulder gradually on earthen vessels. The dense vapour of rosemary and sage permeated the atmosphere, thought to repel corrupted forces and calm the frame. The girl was instructed to rest or recline peacefully while the nuns circled her, reciting prayers that resonated quietly against the granite. A heated fabric soaked in liquid mixed with plants was laid against her flesh. The friction that came next was strong and consistent, travelling down her limbs, her midsection and her legs. To the perspective of the institution, this was an expression of washing. To the women experiencing it, it was a period of close attention masked by ceremony. It's almost paradoxical that what was termed sacred cleansing was in execution, a deliberate massage intended to settle the frame. The responses of the young women differed. Some became sleepy as heat moved through their tissues. Others shook, their breathing accelerating until they collapsed back in fatigue. These responses were characterized as verification that corruptions had departed or that restless forces had been expelled. Following this, sleep arrived readily, and the women frequently woke peaceful and compliant. Relatives waiting beyond saw only the outcomes, not the techniques. They were informed that the monastery had accomplished a silent wonder. The reality of the frame's automatic responses was never discussed. This silence was calculated. The nuns understood the threat of being charged with misconduct. To shield themselves, they surrounded every gesture in levels of worship and holy text. They portrayed their labour only as spiritual assistance, never as bodily procedure. Women departing the monastery were directed not to discuss what had been performed, only to praise the divine for their transformation. The The discretion granted the ceremony influence. It made it immune to opponents because no one could challenge what was never articulated. If we were to convert this into contemporary context, it would be as if medical attendants addressed patients through bodily therapy, but compelled them to name it heavenly intervention instead of attention. Inside monastery barriers, this sequence became standard. Women arrived for intervals of discipline, returned home steadier, and then were delivered back once more when difficulties reappeared. The pattern gave the monasteries silent power, not merely as locations of devotion, but as concealed facilities. Relatives depended on them, believing the enigma more than they believed transparent descriptions. The nuns, for their role, reconciled faith with understanding, transferred between women, protecting it deliberately against doubt. The discretion formed a tradition of murmurs among the sisters, specifics of which plants calmed most effectively and which techniques brought the most complete rest were distributed only in confidence. These instructions were conveyed not in documents, but in execution, from experienced nuns to novice ones. The understanding existed within their touch, not their language. What they couldn't recognize audibly, they transmitted through contact and routine. I discover myself picturing the tension they must have experienced, understanding their labour-assisted, but worrying it might be criticised if ever discussed too directly. For the women who experienced these procedures, the situation was perplexing. Comfort arrived, but it was portrayed as heavenly favour. They couldn't portray their own feelings truthfully, for to do so would be threatening. Appreciation was conveyed through worship, not through comprehension. Their frames discovered rest, but their thoughts remained constrained by silence. The conflict was evident. The very establishment that proclaimed cleanliness depended on concealed gestures that could never be stated. The perception of the monastery as a refuge hid this concealed dimension of function. Observers saw barriers of order and worship, while inside women were silently calmed through warmth, plants and contact. This dual reality shows how vulnerable truth can be when language is prohibited. What might have been termed care was presented as ceremony, and what might have been honoured as understanding was concealed under discretion. The influence of these methods extended beyond the barriers. Relatives grew reliant on monasteries to discipline their daughters. Societies acknowledged the power of the ceremonies without inquiry. Women themselves discovered to connect comfort with silence, never attempting to assert their own reality. The pattern guaranteed that understanding remained regulated, transferred silently between those who possessed it, but never permitted to emerge in transparent conversation. The monasteries, like the midwives preceding them, reveal how women's well-being in the Middle Ages existed in two realities. In one, visible descriptions wrapped distress in myth and dominance. In the other, concealed methods provided genuine ease, though all was dressed in language of sanctity. This division characterized much of the female reality in that period, the truth of the frame hidden underneath the vocabulary of the essence. The account of monastery sanctification is not only about care, but also about dominance. Women discovered comfort, but they also absorbed compliance. Their transformation was honoured not as comprehension, but as surrender. What should have been recognized as automatic was transformed into verification of heavenly discipline. In this manner, the monasteries maintained the identical sequences of power discovered in institutions and tribunals, even as they silently relieved the distress of those who arrived to them. The ceremonies of washing in monasteries expose the conflicts of the Middle Ages. They demonstrate how discretion permitted understanding to continue while also keeping it vulnerable. They remind us that even within establishments committed to faith, women discovered methods to attend to one another, though never in language that invited discovery. The monasteries became locations where distress was calmed, but never clarified where truth was concealed, yet executed regularly. They remain as silent witnesses to a reality where care existed in the darkness of silence. what occurred within monastery barriers directs us toward the expanding participation of male practitioners who asserted power over the frame. These individuals would advance with examinations dressed as knowledge, positioning their touch where they insisted to investigate for sickness and extending procedures until women's frames responded in methods they could defend as a remedy. In the Middle Ages, the boundary between medical work and individual violation was frequently unclear, especially when it involved the handling of women. Among the most disturbing illustrations were the examinations performed by practitioners who asserted to be investigating for indicators of sickness in the lower midsection and legs. These men, frequently identifying themselves as doctors or customary practitioners, maintained that their contact was directed by ancient medical knowledge. They claimed that the womb and its adjacent regions contained the answers to women's well-being, and that by pressing deeply and rubbing or adjusting the lower frame, they could identify and remedy disorders. The reasoning sounded legitimate to relatives searching for solutions, but in actuality, the techniques created an opening for misuse. Women were instructed to remain motionless on surfaces or timber platforms, their garments modified to permit access to the regions considered essential for examination. Preparations were occasionally spread, claimed to stimulate the circulation and ease the womb. Fingers travelled gradually across the midsection, applying pressure and hesitating, as though investigating for invisible origins of ailment. When women responded with tremors or sharp breaths, the practitioner would assert that circulation was enhancing or that obstructions were being cleared. These responses were documented as medical achievement. It's challenging not to recognise the foolishness of naming a woman's automatic tremor verification of recovered well-being, when it was merely the automatic response of her frame to extended contact. The appointments frequently continued far beyond what was required. Practitioners contended that persistence was essential, that the womb was resistant and demanded continuous persuasion. In execution, this meant women were subjected to prolonged handling until their frames responded in methods that could be understood as beneficial. Relatives watching close by were comforted by the practitioner's assured language, while the women experiencing it had no protected method to dispute what was occurring. Their silence was interpreted as acceptance, and their responses were portrayed as verification of progress. These methods flourished because they were dressed in the power of custom. Medical writings duplicated from ancient documents portrayed the womb as delicate and susceptible to disorder, which granted believability to the notion that direct handling was required. Societies embraced the descriptions, assuming that what appeared distressing must be beneficial. Women were informed that their well-being relied on acceptance of the process, and resisting it threatened being identified as resistant or uninformed. If compared to contemporary context, it would be as if doctors demanded on addressing every instance of abdominal discomfort with extended touching, then recorded the patient's flush or tremor as proof of achievement. For the women, the situation was bewildering and frequently degrading. They could sense their frames responding, but they were provided no language to portray it truthfully. Instead, they were informed that the contractions were indicators of recovered equilibrium, that the womb had been calmed, or that harmful vapours had been expelled. The comfort they occasionally experienced following was attributed to the practitioner's knowledge rather than recognised as an automatic response. This left them doubtful of what had actually occurred and reliant on additional appointments when discomfort reappeared. The environment in which these examinations occurred added to their legitimacy. Spaces were faintly illuminated, with plants smouldering in small containers to establish a feeling of gravity. The smell of vapour mixed with the sound of recitations or murmured directions. Relatives were frequently present, strengthening the notion that the ceremony was appropriate. Every element was organised to make the situation appear essential, even sacred, despite the distress of the women enduring it. I find it profoundly troubling to picture how many women accepted these examinations assuming they were being healed, while in reality they were trapped in a pattern of dominance presented as attention. These methods reflected the wider perspectives of the period. Women's frames were regarded as enigmatic, unpredictable, and vulnerable to ailment that only men could decode. Their expressions were not believed, their awareness of their own feelings dismissed. Instead, the responses of their frames under adjustment became the standard of well-being. This stripped them of control and converted their situations into information for others to decode. The misuse was not always deliberate, but the structure permitted it. Some practitioners may have assumed genuinely in what they were performing, influenced by writings that discussed wombs travelling and fluids captured in the midsection. Others, however, obviously exploited the permission provided by their position. They extended procedures unnecessarily, pursued responses they understood would occur, and proclaimed them as remedies. The absence of supervision meant there was minimal to prevent them. The effects endured. Women went home believing their ailments had been fixed, only to experience the same pain. Days passed. They returned to the practitioners, certain that more examination was necessary. Their families encouraged this, thinking it was vital treatment. The pattern continued, creating reliance while never solving the real sources of distress. This tale of examinations reveals how power can disguise invasion. By framing their techniques as medical obligation, practitioners gained confidence and entry that women couldn't deny. What belonged in private became exposed, and what deserved questioning was embraced as fact. In the broader context, these methods belonged to the continuing tradition of misinterpretation. Women's wellness. During the Middle Ages, the human form was understood through myth, governed by power and exposed to procedures that confused the boundary between care and damage. Women persisted because they lacked options, and their comfort was determined not by their own testimony, but by the declarations of authorities. These examinations were characterized as methods to enhance flow and re-establish harmony. Yet truly, they sustained reliance and quietness. Women's responses were portrayed as treatments, their pain concealed under the burden of medical dominance. The inheritance of these methods reminds us how delicate fact becomes when understanding is withheld and power is presented as compassion. The practitioners who extended their examinations produced more than fleeting comfort. They formed assumptions of what care should resemble, convincing families that extended sessions and visible responses were essential. This assumption would persist into other ceremonies and other places, shaping how women were managed. For generations, the examinations of the lower regions justified as treatment left a disturbing record. They demonstrate how simply power can transform invasion into care, and how women's quietness can be confused with agreement. The tradition didn't stop there. Before long, fresh justifications would surface, focused on the notion that women's sickness originated from blockages of essential fluids, from confined energies that demanded release. The remedies for these blockages would again require contact, warmth, and compelled responses, perpetuating the pattern of misinterpretation under another label. In medieval understanding, the female form was portrayed as a container that readily captured impurities. Doctors and practitioners claimed that because women didn't expel what they termed essential fluids, their forms became clogged. This reasoning explained nearly every type of pain, from migraines to unease, as indication of confined energies. The logic was straightforward but deceptive. Women struggled because their forms retained what should have been removed. The solution, they insisted, was to extract these poisons through ceremonial warmth and contact. In execution, this meant exposing women to processes that compelled visible responses, then marking those responses as evidence of recovery. The remedies frequently started with plants. Nettle, sage, or wormwood was heated in vessels until their vapour occupied the space. The subject, typically a young woman or spouse delivered by her family, was instructed to sit or bend over the ascending mist. Covers or thick garments were secured around her to contain the warmth so that the gases would enter her form. As time elapsed, her respiration became strained, her flesh wet with moisture, and her frame rigid from the oppressive heat. Practitioners maintained this was the indication of impurities releasing. They professed that the form would shortly discharge what had been confined within. It's remarkable how simple perspiration and shaking were reinterpreted as evidence of wicked gases departing the form. The following phase frequently required manipulation. Heated ointments prepared from plants were applied onto the belly and legs, the practitioner pushing in patterns or moving steadily till the woman started to inhale sharply or jerk. Any motion was considered triumphant, a visible proof that the barrier was dissolving. When women's forms responded more intensely, generating tremors or liquids, the practitioner would announce that the blockage had been eliminated. Families positioned close by embraced these statements without doubt, grateful to learn that the distress had been handled. The truth was much less obvious. Women might sense temporary lightness following such encounters, but the fundamental issues of scarcity, inadequate nourishment, or tension were unaddressed. The comfort was brief, yet the ceremonies provided the appearance of management. Communities became familiar with the pattern. Sickness identified as blockage, responses viewed as remedy, and the reappearance of signs regarded as evidence that another encounter was needed. If pictured in contemporary times, it would resemble alerting that compelling someone into heated rooms until they lost consciousness could purify them of sadness or worry. The reality for the women themselves was challenging. They were instructed to withstand warmth until their minds swam and their forms trembled, while those surrounding them observed with satisfaction. Their responses, which could have been embarrassing or terrifying in different situations, were here honoured as triumph. Still, they had no opportunity to clarify what they genuinely experienced. The justifications were already composed for them. What they went through was not regarded as individual, but as proof of concepts developed by men who would never face the same remedies. The ceremonies strengthened quietness. Women were not meant to challenge the techniques or express their feelings truthfully. Rather, they were prompted to view themselves as containers of impurity, drained only by the action of others. This outlook removed their power over their own forms. It rendered them reliant on practitioners who duplicated the same ceremonies repeatedly, converting natural responses into a pattern of controlled distress. I can't help but consider how draining it must have been to understand that every shake or breath would be read not as one's own but as evidence of another's concept. In the shadowy spaces where these encounters occurred, the environment was thick with haze and secrecy. The odour of burning plants attached to the surfaces, and the sound of boiling liquid merged with murmured prayers. The women crouched beneath fabrics or rested on platforms, their forms shaking, while practitioners leaned forward with assured movements. The surroundings made it all appear unavoidable, even holy. For families, the sight of moisture and weariness was comforting because it resembled work being accomplished, like sickness departing the form. The results of these convictions extended beyond the person. Whole communities absorbed the acceptance of pain and distress as marks of impurity. They assumed that the female form demanded constant adjustment, that it couldn't govern itself without action. This influenced how women were regarded, rendering them seemingly frailer, more reliant, and constantly requiring direction. The ceremonies became not merely medical remedies, but also instruments of social management. What's notable is the endurance of women who faced these methods. Despite the pain, they moved forward with everyday existence, raising children, managing households, and labouring in gardens. Their power was obscured behind the terminology of impurity and adjustment, but it existed in every moment of persistence. While practitioners declared victory, the women themselves carried the actual burden. The concept of confined liquids continued for generations because it was simple and observable. Responses could always be generated with sufficient warmth or force, and those responses could always be justified as triumphant. The pattern strengthened itself, providing little space for uncertainty. In a world where challenging power was risky, such concepts thrived without check. These remedies reveal more about the values of the era than about women's wellness. They expose a culture more invested in presentations and management than with authentic comprehension. They demonstrate how readily natural bodily responses can be misconstrued when authority remains in the possession of a few. The ceremonies constructed around confined liquids influenced not only how women were managed, but also how they were understood. They were depicted as volatile, impure, and constantly requiring purification. This portrayal strengthened their reliance and restricted their liberty. In the silent conclusion of these encounters, when the plants had burned away and the women rested in weariness, families offered gratitude and practitioners declared victory. Yet the pattern was never interrupted, and the reality of the form remained concealed under layers of myth. These convictions, however, were not the ultimate statement. In the spaces where plants were burned and women were forced to shake, another phase of remedy was already being arranged. This phase would occur in murkier chambers, illuminated by weak lamps and occupied with the thick odour of resins, where secrecy intensified even further, and the responses of the form were disguised as meetings with sacred force. Spaces employed for remedies in the Middle Ages were organised to establish an environment of mystery and management. Instead of intense sunlight, practitioners favoured areas separated from the external realm. Thick barriers covered the openings, keeping the space in near blackness, with only weak candle glow wavering against the surfaces. This shadowy arrangement was justified as defence from wicked spirits, for intense light was believed to welcome invasion from powers unseen. The darkness, though, also hid what actually occurred inside. Families remaining outside heard only murmurs and dampened noises, never observing the specifics. What occurred in those spaces was abandoned to fantasy, presented as holy labour that couldn't be challenged. The ceremonies started with the burning of resins and roots. Pine sap was liquefied on small plates, its dense haze spiralling upward to occupy the air. Mandrake, a root extensively connected to myth, was crushed and cast onto embers, producing a thick, harsh smell. The air became heavy, hard to inhale, as women were positioned in arrangements designed to expose the lower form. Kneeling was typical, sometimes with covers positioned around them to capture the gases. As the plants burned, moisture started to appear on their flesh. Their respiration became shallow, and their forms replied to the warmth and force ascending from beneath. It's nearly absurd to consider that light-headedness and shaking from haze and warmth were reread as sacred spirits working. The women experiencing these encounters frequently lost their awareness of time. The shadowy glow, the dense haze, and the repetition of prayers generated a fog that merged minutes into hours. Practitioners remained close, chanting quietly and observing carefully for any physical response. When a woman shuddered, inhaled sharply, or fell in weariness, the moment was captured as evidence that the remedy had worked. It was declared that the spirit inside her had been compelled out, or that her womb had been cleansed by the sacred air. Families were calmed with these justifications, persuaded that what they had observed was sacred intervention. Every aspect of the arrangement reinforced this assumption. The blackness, the haze, the weak illumination of candles. Combined, they established an environment where simple responses could be presented as exceptional. Women's tremors were characterized not as the form's natural reply, but as indications of invisible powers leaving. The space itself became piece of the remedy, influencing interpretation as much as any contact or plant. If contrasted to the current day, it would be as if a subject fainted in an overwarmed steam room, and physicians proclaimed it a success of spiritual purification. These spaces were not expansive, frequently little more than tiny chambers connected to religious houses, residences, or practitioners' facilities. Their restriction made the environment more severe. Air became stagnant rapidly, thick with haze that attached to flesh and garments. Women departing such locations bore the smell of resin and moisture, a physical indication of what they had faced. They came back to families exhausted but quieter, and the external appearance of calm was sufficient to validate the method. Nobody questioned whether the comfort originated from weariness instead of genuine recovery. The secrecy of the arrangement also granted the ceremony's authority. Because outsiders were seldom permitted to witness, the accounts that circulated about what occurred inside became more inflated. Murmurs mentioned women writhing, of sounds calling out, of spirits escaping the form. These accounts strengthened the power of the practitioners, making families more willing to deliver their daughters or spouses for remedy. Quietness became element of the ceremony itself, shielding it from uncertainty. For the women, the reality was frequently alarming. The warmth, the haze, the nearness of the space made breathing difficult, and the responses of their forms felt crushing. Still, they possessed no terminology to express what they faced, only the justifications provided to them. Following, they were informed that their shudders were indications of discharge, that their frailty was evidence of purification. Their own sensations were dismissed, substituted by statements that belonged to others. I can't help but sense the heaviness of that quietness, where women's actual expressions were stifled by ceremonies designed to read their every breath as something outside their management. The organisation of these spaces also represented the way culture addressed women's wellness, concealed, managed and presented through dread. Just as the chambers restricted the light, the reality of women's forms was maintained in blackness. What could have been comprehended as natural was changed into mystery, and what could have been challenged was proclaimed holy. The enduring influence of these methods was significant. Generations became familiar with the concept that women required secret, shadowy chambers for their wellness. The portrayal of shaking in candlelight became linked to the concept of recovery, guaranteeing that women themselves absorbed these remedies as unavoidable. The very arrangement instructed them that distress was element of purification and that quietness was the cost of healing. The employment of sealed, smoky spaces stands as one of the most obvious instances of how myth and management influenced treatment. The surroundings was as much an instrument as the plants or the prayers. It rendered the simple appear exceptional, masking pain as holy discharge. Women were abandoned with weariness and quietness, while practitioners declared triumph, and families assumed the threat had vanished. Inside these chambers, the reality of the form was concealed behind haze and darkness. Women appeared quieter, but also more connected to a pattern they couldn't break. The recollection of what they faced remained, but the statements to clarify it were never permitted. This dependence on secret areas arranged the foundation for fresh forms of justification. Before long, the tremors and inhalations that occupied those spaces would be redefined once more, not as spiritual discharge, but as enigmatic processes of the womb itself. The same responses would be renamed, reformed and employed to strengthen management under a separate vocabulary. Medieval practitioners and the clergy seldom mentioned directly what women's forms experienced. When tremors, inhalations or shaking appeared during remedies, these responses were deliberately concealed under separate labels. Instead of recognizing pleasure, they termed it purification, discharge, or purification of the womb. Phrases like removing poisons or cleaning the organs were employed to present what occurred as something sacred and corrective. This selection of terminology was not random. By evading the actual term for physical pleasure, those holding power guaranteed that management remained securely in their possession. Women couldn't label what they sensed, and without a label, their reality was simple to reform into something completely separate. The employment of unclear labels fulfilled many functions. It permitted clergy to pursue their ceremonies without confronting charges of misconduct, since they professed only to be assisting women eliminate themselves of harmful airs or spiritual impurities. It calmed families who could otherwise be disturbed by the visible responses of their daughters or spouses, and it granted the practitioners power since they alone could justify what the tremors signified. The women themselves were abandoned quiet. Their natural replies were read for them, redefined as proof of sickness, adjusted instead of feelings of their own. It's nearly ridiculous to consider that a simple physical discharge was masked as a mystical purification. Still, the mask was sufficient to preserve power. This control of terminology was forceful. Without precise statements, women possessed no structure to comprehend their own forms. They couldn't assert understanding or examine their realities openly. Rather, they were instructed to regard their responses as signs that demanded external management. The absence of vocabulary became another restraint connecting them to quietness. If converted into a contemporary arrangement, it would be as if subjects, today, were prohibited from employing medical phrases and compelled to term every remedy a miracle, abandoning all justification in the possession of others. Inside remedy spaces, these phrases were duplicated with gravity. When a woman writhed, the practitioner would declare that the womb had been liberated of its loads. When she exhaled in weariness, it was termed the discharge of confined humours. When liquids surfaced, they were declared to be poisons, departing the form. Every indication of natural stimulation or peak was changed into something else, removed of its actual significance. The women, already diminished by warmth, force, or haze, possessed no alternative but to embrace these justifications. The institution strengthened this method by prohibiting open examination of sexual pleasure. Pleasure was associated with wrongdoing, attraction, and the devil's power. To recognize that women could sense it, particularly in religious or medical arrangements, would have contested the basis of management. By removing the statement, they removed the chance of women identifying their own ability for longing. In this manner, terminology became an instrument of superiority, influencing not only what women could declare, but also what they could picture. For numerous women, this quietness was bewildering. They sensed comfort and even contentment following remedies, yet they were informed it was a purification of the spirit. Appreciation was anticipated, not interest. They absorbed to read their own feelings as indications of compliance instead of as manifestations of their forms. Over time, the duplicated employment of unclear phrases constructed a culture where women themselves prevented labelling pleasure, persuaded that to do so would identify them as impure or controlled. I find it disturbing how successfully statements were employed to remove reality, abandoning generations of women incapable to express the most fundamental elements of their own forms. The prevention of the actual label also shielded the practitioners from examination. If they had confessed that their techniques generated pleasure, challenges of morality and purpose would have emerged by redefining responses as purification. They maintained themselves protected. Communities embraced the justifications, persuaded that what appeared questionable was truly holy labour. The mask became self-perpetuating, duplicated from one generation to the following until it appeared natural. This tradition exposes how much authority remains in terminology. By managing statements, the powers managed realities. They established a realm where women's facts could be concealed in obvious view, reformed until they fulfilled the requirements of others. The shaking of a form was no longer hers, but proof of spiritual adjustment. The exhale of discharge was no longer hers, but evidence of impurity. Removed, the action of labelling was seized, and with it, the opportunity for women to assert possession of their feelings. The results extended well beyond the remedy spaces. In residences, families duplicated the same unclear phrases when mentioning women's wellness. In communities, accounts circulated employing the same coded terminology. Over time, the lack of precise statements abandoned whole societies incapable to mention directly about female reality. Quietness became standard, and what couldn't be mentioned about couldn't be comprehended. By declining to label pleasure, medieval culture not only refused women understanding, but also strengthened their reliance. They were rendered to assume that what occurred to them was enigmatic, threatening, and always requiring adjustment. Their forms became subjects of ceremony instead of subjects of comprehension. The removal of the statement established the extended darkness. Even generations afterward, reflections of this quietness persisted with female pleasure, frequently rejected, disregarded, or treated as illness. The origins of that quietness were established in those medieval spaces where unclear phrases substitute fact and secrecy substituted truthfulness. The account of unlabeled pleasure reminds us how profoundly management can influence terminology and how terminology, consequently, can influence reality. What couldn't be labeled couldn't be possessed. Women's forms became locations of mystery, not because they were incomprehensible, but that was because they were intentionally misrepresented. These layers of quiet prepared the ground for what followed. Women who found relief sometimes described it as feeling unburdened, as if released from what weighed them down. Even this was swiftly reinterpreted by clergy as dangerous, a moment demanding confession to purify the spirit. The pattern of comfort, remorse, and quiet grew deeper, tying women more firmly to those who defined their realities for them. Following procedures in shadowy rooms thick with incense and ceremony, some women spoke of an unusual lightness that emerged. They whispered about profound rest that came after the sessions, bodies that seemed less burdened and thoughts that appeared sharper. The strain they'd held for days or weeks had vanished, replaced by peace that made ordinary tasks feel simpler. Households observed the shift too, watching women emerge from the healer or convent with softer faces and restored vitality. For a short time, it appeared the procedures had succeeded in the most tangible way, providing actual relief from distress and anxiety. Still, this relief wasn't openly acknowledged. The instant a woman confessed to feeling unburdened or more at ease, she was cautioned by clergy or spiritual advisors that such feelings weren't completely innocent. She was informed that her flesh had been exposed, that what she experienced was evidence of susceptibility to wrongdoing. Rather than being helped to recognize her response as ordinary, she was warned she'd permitted harmful influences inside. It's nearly absurd to consider that a woman's wellness could be labeled as spiritual frailty instead of recognized as proof of recovery. The guidance that came next was always identical: confession. Women who spoke of their relief were directed to kneel before clergy and speak words of contrition. They were instructed to ask pardon for having permitted their bodies to respond too openly. What had seemed like grace was recast as transgression, an opening of the being to demonic power. Households embraced this reasoning without doubt, grateful to trust that the priest had corrected what the healer had initiated. For the women, though, the situation was deeply contradictory. They held both the sensation of ease and the burden of remorse. This pattern generated an odd paradox. Relief was attained, but it was instantly clouded by dishonor. Women came to mistrust their own feelings, to regard their peace and their happiness as questionable. The procedures that gave them comfort also led them into confessionals, where their words were shaped into declarations of regret. Compared to our time, it would be as though patients were criticized for feeling better after medication, told that their improvement was evidence they'd surrendered to frailty. The psychological weight of this paradox was substantial. Women retained the sensation of rest but didn't dare mention it publicly. Rather, they concealed their thankfulness under layers of remorse. Some refused to acknowledge how well they felt at all, worried that their statements would only invite more condemnation. Others embraced the pattern, viewing confession as connected to the recovery, though it stripped them of the opportunity to truly comprehend their own flesh. Within convents, this sequence became a typical rhythm. A woman would come tense and troubled, experience the ceremonies of incense, warmth, or touch, then depart with her flesh calmer. almost right away, she was told to confess. Her relief was recognized only through the framework of wrongdoing and forgiveness. The establishment maintained its dominance by guaranteeing that even beneficial results didn't belong to the women themselves. I find it profoundly disturbing to think how many women came to connect their own tranquility with remorse, never permitted to appreciate the ease they momentarily discovered. This arrangement kept women caught between quiet and surrender. To mention their relief was to invite criticism. To remain quiet was to delete their reality. Either path meant their feelings weren't their own. Power rested with those who labelled them, whether healer or priest. The women themselves became inactive recipients, containers through which others strengthened their beliefs and their control. The wider society mirrored the same understanding. Relief and comfort were viewed not as ordinary results, but as indicators of frailty. Women were portrayed as delicate creatures who needed persistent oversight not only of their deeds, but of their sensations. The Church stressed that the flesh was an entrance for wrongdoing, and so even feelings that suggested recovery had to be managed. The outcome was a world where women mistrusted themselves, unable to distinguish ordinary responses from enforced narratives. Generations matured under this sequence. Daughters absorbed from mothers that to feel unburdened after procedures was both fortune and weight. Statements of thankfulness were murmured in kitchens or behind shut doors, never voiced in public. The sensation of tranquility was transmitted, along with cautions to stay vigilant. With time, the quiet became customary, and the link between wellness and remorse intensified. The paradox emerges as one of the harshest aspects of medieval perspectives toward women's wellness. At the precise instant when women might have started to trust their own flesh, they were instructed instead to distrust it even more. Relief was attainable, but comprehension was prohibited. Their realities were taken twice, first by being relabeled, then by being denounced. The accounts of these women show us how profoundly power can influence even the most intimate feelings. By controlling how women understood their own sensations, the Church guaranteed that they stayed reliant, compliant, and quiet. The pattern of procedure and confession wasn't only about wellness, but also about control. The women who exited those spaces held both tranquility and dishonour. They existed with the awareness that their flesh had provided them ease, but that their spirits had been labelled as frail. The relief they experienced was real, yet it was always clouded by dread. This sequence of combining recovery with remorse didn't conclude here. Shortly other methods would surface, driving women into even harsher forms of ceremony, where their discomfort was increased and their responses understood as evidence of invasion or disturbance. The connection between the flesh's responses and ethical assessment only intensified, setting the foundation for even more invasive forms of dominance. Young women in the Middle Ages, who seemed sad or uneasy, were swiftly marked as disturbed. Households worried that sorrow or strange conduct meant invasion or sickness, and so the answer provided was often a ceremony of vapour. These meetings occurred in small enclosed spaces, where air became thick and breathing became difficult. A big pot of boiling liquid mixed with plants such as sage, thyme or rosemary was positioned beneath a wooden chair or bench. The young woman was instructed to sit above it, while attendants fed the embers to maintain the vapour ascending. The dense fog attached to her skin and entered her flesh, making her perspire until her garments were moist and her hair clung to her face. The warmth was crushing, but to observers this was evidence that the flesh was being purified of its concealed troubles. The attendants approached their task earnestly, thinking that the vapour itself transported away corruptions. They modified the coverings around the girl to contain the fog, compelling her to inhale the harsh, sharp scent of boiled plants. Her face reddened, her breathing accelerated, and shortly beads of perspiration ran down her neck and chest. Sometimes the vapour scorched against delicate skin, but no objection was permitted. The ceremony had to persist till her flesh showed a visible response. where the shaking tremors were expelling liquids. It's grimly paradoxical that fatigue and near fainting were praised as victories of recovery. For the young women, the situation was bewildering and terrifying. They entered the vapor room feeling frail, only to be put through an ordeal that forced their flesh beyond ease. The vertigo, the shaking, the feeling of choking, these were all dismissed as evidence that corruptions were departing. If they collapsed, it was termed a turning point. If they struggled for air, it was stated the force inside them was finally exiting. Their distress was presented as achievement, leaving no room for their own words. The plants themselves differed, but the result was comparable. Powerful smelling vegetation was thought to open the flesh and expel sorrow. The sharp fog burned the throat and vision, making women cry without intention. These tears were interpreted as another indication of purification. Households who waited beyond often felt comforted when they witnessed their daughters emerge pale, frail, and quiet, thinking this meant the affliction had been removed. If pictured in current times, it would be like positioning a young woman in heated air until she fainted, then declaring she was healed of sadness. The procedures were duplicated whenever symptoms returned. A girl who kept dreaming restlessly or weeping quietly at home could anticipate being returned to the vapor room. Over time, many absorbed how to conceal their emotions, worried that any show of sorrow would mean another meeting. Quiet became safer than expression, and submission was confused for improvement. Within the spaces, the environment was severe and stifling. The ground became slippery with condensed vapour, the walls damp with moisture. Attendants maintained the flames active, adding plants to strengthen the scent. The girl sat bent on the bench, perspiration dripping, the fabric covering her flesh clinging firmly. Every shake of her limbs, every quickened breath was observed carefully and understood as advancement. The instant her strength failed, the ceremony was proclaimed complete. The bodily cost was considerable. Skin sometimes formed blisters from extended contact with vapour. Lungs became aggravated, and frailty remained for days. Yet, none of this was documented as damage. Rather, it was woven into the story of recovery, strengthening the conviction that the method functioned. Women were informed they should be thankful, and many echoed the statements, even as they feared the next meeting. I find it troubling to picture how many young women bore this in quiet, never able to confess that the procedure itself was the origin of their distress. The method of vapour demonstrates how little space medieval society provided for a real comprehension of women's wellness. Emotional difficulties were not viewed as ordinary responses to hardship, but as indicators of disturbance that required correction. The procedures didn't ask why women experienced sorrow or worry. They concentrated only on compelling responses that could be marked as healings. This method silenced women doubly, first by rejecting their emotions, and then by converting their distress into alleged proof of improvement. Communities backed the ceremonies because they provided visible outcomes. A woman who exited the vapor room limp and quiet appeared different from the one who had come in, restless and emotional. That difference was sufficient to persuade households that something significant had occurred. They didn't recognize that the shift came from fatigue, not recovery. The pattern persisted because it appeared to supply answers, though it increased women's susceptibility. With time, the ceremony of vapor became one of the most frequent responses to female sorrow. It merged the power of custom with the spectacle of bodily response, making it difficult to question for those who used it. The proof was undeniable. Women shook, perspired, and became still, which must have indicated the healing had succeeded. In truth, these meetings left women frailer and more fearful, their sorrow unaddressed, their flesh strained. The ceremonies strengthened the conviction that women couldn't be trusted to comprehend their own emotions, and that dominance had to come from beyond. The vapor rooms, dense with smoke and perspiration, became representations of how easily distress could be misread as advancement. The account of these procedures reveals the profound divide between reality and understanding. In the Middle Ages, women bore responses they couldn't label, while others asserted the authority to clarify them. Their sorrow was never addressed, only transformed into a pattern of quiet and ceremony. These ceremonies of enforced warmth and concealed distress set the foundation for even more disturbing clarifications. Shortly, the very spasms and shudders women showed would be proclaimed indicators not of sorrow, but of invasion, proof that their spirits were under assault, and the procedures would become harsher still as clergy stepped forward to assert power over the flesh and spirit together. During the Middle Ages, the responses of women's flesh were seldom understood at surface level. When a woman shook, struggled for air, or voiced sounds during a ceremony, the occurrence was not viewed as a bodily response, but instead as proof of spiritual powers at work. Spasms were termed indicators that corrupt forces had departed the womb. Shudders and shakes were clarified as the spirit expelling itself of affliction. What might have been recognized as ordinary responses to force, warmth, or contact were instead portrayed as meetings with the sacred. Women were left wordless, informed that their realities were evidence of something beyond them, never their own. The terminology used to present these responses mattered profoundly. A shake was termed the force exiting the afflicted womb. A breath was stated to be air expelled from corruption. Liquids were clarified as poisons escaping through sacred action. By covering every indicator with spiritual language, the healers and clergy guaranteed that women couldn't claim their feelings for themselves. The flesh no longer belonged to the woman. Sensation belonged to those who understood it. It's nearly ridiculous to picture that something so intimate as bodily comfort was converted into proof of holy discipline. This arrangement of clarification held power because it comforted households and communities. Rather than being frightened by the strength of women's responses, they were informed to view them as advancement. A daughter convulsing on the ground was not a reason for alarm, but for comfort. Since it indicated the ceremony had succeeded, parents could exit the procedure room persuaded that wrong had been expelled, while clergy increased their own power by dominating the story. The woman herself had no opportunity to portray what she experienced in her own terms. The quiet imposed upon women was intentional. They were discouraged from posing questions and instructed never to oppose. To mention comfort, relief, or even dread was risky. Rather, they were told that their flesh was frail containers, easily entered by forces and only made pure through surrender. The understanding was plain: compliance was the healing, and quiet was the excellence. If positioned in current language, it would be like physicians now proclaiming that a patient's relief after procedure was not improvement, but evidence of wrongdoing, requiring thankfulness for discipline instead of attention. The psychological cost was enormous. Women exited procedures with flesh unburdened and calmer, but their ease was relabeled as a consequence of sacred punishment. Rather than satisfaction or comprehension, they held remorse. What they experienced was presented not as recovery, but as evidence of decay burned away. This twisted reasoning guaranteed that no woman could assert possession of her own feelings. Every shake, every breath, every expulsion was removed from her and transformed into the terminology of the church. The ceremony locations amplified this feeling of dominance. The spaces were shadowy, thick with smoke, with clergy or attendants speaking steadily. The presence of candles and incense generated an environment of seriousness that prevented questions. Women knelt or remained motionless, often encircled by observers who strengthened the understanding of every motion. Their intimate responses were made communal, understood vocally, and then incorporated into a narrative that deleted their own reality. I find it profoundly disturbing to picture how many women held the sensation of ease stained by dishonour, never permitted to term it their own. The method also strengthened wider cultural sequences. Comfort was linked with risk, so it had to be hidden. Women's words were rejected, so understandings were forced. Power rested completely with men, whether healers, clergy, or observers. Women became inactive characters in narratives told about them, instead of active contributors in their own existences. The pattern duplicated across communities, making feeling and misreading part of daily truth. Generations of women matured under this pressure. Mothers who had borne the ceremonies themselves transmitted the same clarifications to their daughters. They cautioned them to be compliant, to refrain from mentioning what they experienced, and to embrace confession afterward. This guaranteed that the quiet persisted. Even when women whispered to one another, they lacked the language to portray their realities honestly. The terminology had been removed, replaced with spiritual codes that kept them reliant on others. The results reached far past individual procedures. By redefining bodily comfort as a spiritual response, medieval society established a perspective where women weren't permitted to acknowledge themselves as capable of desire or even ordinary responses. Their flesh was presented only as locations of decay or purification, never as their own. The effect of this rejection was deep, influencing perspectives for centuries ahead. In the conclusion, what stayed was a pattern of ceremony and quiet. Women shook, their responses relabeled as holy indicators, and their ease was concealed under remorse. Communities praised what they witnessed. Clergy proclaimed triumph, and women themselves were left with nothing but bewilderment. Their flesh spoke plainly, but their words were condemned. This sequence of redefining female reality prepared the foundation for even more intentional uses of dominance. The notion that comfort could never be labelled permitted men to employ it as an instrument, calming women who were restless and converting their responses into proof of compliance. What started as belief shortly became a technique of influencing conduct. The acceptance of this reasoning marked a shift. If a woman's own feelings could be removed from her, then her very intention could be shaped to match the requirements of power. What began as shaking in smoke-thick spaces developed into a method of employing the flesh itself as a means of dominance. The sensation of these ceremonies leaves us with a haunting image. Women compelled into quiet, their ordinary responses twisted into accounts of forces and discipline, their tranquility forever mixed with dishonour. Yet this wasn't the conclusion. From these rooms surfaced a fresh use of the flesh's responses, one that advanced beyond belief into direct manipulation, where husbands and clergy together discovered ways to employ comfort as a tool of compliance. As the medieval ceremonies around women's flesh became more embraced, something altered in how they were employed. What had previously been clarified as purification or recovery slowly converted into an intentional technique of dominance. Households and communities started to observe a sequence. Women who exited procedure rooms emerged quieter, calmer, and more prepared to comply. This recognition didn't stay limited to clergy or healers. Husbands acknowledged it as well, and they started to direct their wives for meetings not because of affliction, but because of resistance. What began as belief transformed into an instrument, one that obscured the boundary between medicine and correction. The reasoning was straightforward. A wife who disputed, opposed, or voiced dissatisfaction could be portrayed as experiencing from disturbance in the womb or disproportion of the fluids. The answer was to direct her to a priest or healer who would put her through the typical ceremonies of smoke, warmth, or touch. Following the meeting, her flesh often responded in ways that left her bodily exhausted but emotionally subdued. She emerged home calmer, less prepared to oppose her husband's intention. To observers, this appeared like recovery. To the men who organised it, it was a successful way to restore compliance. It's grimly paradoxical that what was termed medicine became little more than compelled surrender hidden as attention. Clergy promoted the method because it strengthened their power. Every time a woman exited their rooms subdued, it was understood as evidence of spiritual strength. Husbands relied on them more, communities depended on them more, and the pattern intensified. Women were informed that their own opposition was affliction, that compliance was wellness, and that the ceremonies were the healing. With every duplication, the notion became more ordinary, until few questioned whether it was truly about recovery at all. The ceremonies themselves didn't alter much. Women were still positioned in shadowed spaces, put through incense, plants, and bodily contact. But the purpose behind them had altered. The objective was no longer simply to free women of sorrow or invasion, it was to fracture their intention. The shaking and struggling that previously bewildered households were now understood as indicators that the woman's resistance had been burned away. Her calmer condition afterward was praised as evidence that arrangement had been restored. If, measured against our time, it would be like directing someone to a physician, not for wellness worries, but for the aim of making them more compliant at home. For the women, this fresh use of the ceremonies was crushing. They recognized that their own flesh had become tools turned against them. Relief was mixed with dishonor, calmness with remorse. They were caught in a pattern where their ordinary responses were employed to validate their surrender. Voicing objection was unthinkable, since to do so would label them as afflicted. Once more needing more procedure, endurance was the only option left. The method also expanded the divide between men and women in daily existence. Husbands obtained a handy way to impose power. Clergy obtained more power over households, and women forfeited what little control they possessed. The procedures became less about wellness and more about correction, less about relief and more about uniformity. With time, the link between resistance and affliction became so powerful that women themselves started to embrace it. Many came to think that their opposition was truly an indication of affliction, not an ordinary expression of irritation or independence. Within communities, this reasoning dispersed swiftly. Households spoke of wives or daughters requiring correction and looked to the church for answers. Neighbours murmured of women who'd been recovered after procedure, employing the term as a replacement for being subdued. The more the sequence duplicated, the more difficult it became to recognise it for what it was. Power concealed behind the terminology of attention, making it nearly invisible. I find it disturbing to picture how ordinary people embraced this setup, never questioning that recovery was being confused with dominance. This alteration in aim exposes a deeper reality about medieval society. Awareness of women's flesh was never simply about wellness, it was about strength. By labelling resistance as affliction, and by employing ceremonies that compelled visible responses, men could transform women's conduct without ever confessing it was discipline. The flesh became the battlefield, and the terminology of recovery disguised the victory. The pattern also guaranteed reliance. Once a woman had experienced such procedures, her household was prepared to direct her again. At the first indicator of resistance, the ceremonies became self-continuing, strengthening the notion that women required correction and guaranteeing that clergy and healers stayed central to household existence. Every meeting strengthened not just power over the flesh, but power over the home. For the women, there was little prospect of departure. Their realities were silenced, their feelings relabelled, and their conduct influenced to match expectations. What should have been their intimate reality was converted into communal proof against them. Relief, when it arrived, was tied firmly with dishonour, guaranteeing they could never assert it as their own. The account of this method reveals how swiftly belief can be transformed into dominance. What started as attempts to comprehend female affliction concluded as a technique of imposing compliance. The alteration was subtle but powerful, leaving women caught in an arrangement that employed their own flesh to keep them quiet. This sequence didn't halt at compliance within homes. As the ceremonies dispersed, women themselves started to pursue them out, asserting to experience unwell in ways that would return them to the room. Some comprehended more than they confessed, employing the procedures to discover temporary relief, though at the expense of strengthening the arrangement that tied them. This odd paradox marked the following phase, where women's duplicated returns bewildered even the clergy who performed the ceremonies, as the ceremonies of purification became more frequent. A strange sequence started to surface. Women who had already experienced procedures emerged to the convents or healers' rooms, requesting more. They portrayed themselves as disturbed, restless, or burdened by unclear discomforts. Their terminology was vague, a burden in the flesh or a fog in the thoughts, but they were persuasive enough to validate another meeting. Households embraced these clarifications, thinking their daughters or wives still held concealed corruptions. The clergy in presence, though bewildered, didn't decline. Under the terminology of medicine and purity, each appeal was presented as valid, and so the pattern duplicated. The rate of these visits disturbed some of the church. They observed that the same women emerged again and again, despite being proclaimed healed after each ceremony. What was intended to be a single correction of disproportion became, for some, a repeating requirement. Women who exited the room calmer or unburdened returned weeks afterward, asserting that the burden had emerged. Their continuation made clergy uncomfortable, but the power of custom kept them from questioning too profoundly. To reject a woman, another procedure would mean confessing that the ceremonies didn't function, so the pattern was permitted to persist. It's difficult not to recognise the paradox that what was previously termed a healing became a provision that women appealed for repeatedly, bewildering even the men who directed it. The women themselves probably comprehended more than they confessed. They'd experienced actual relief, whether through touch, vapour, or managed spasms. Though wrapped in remorse and quiet, the ease was undeniable. Emerging to the ceremonies was a way of recovering that ease, even if they had to portray it in the terminology of affliction. They couldn't mention comfort, so they mentioned disturbance. They couldn't state they desired expulsion, so they stated they required purification. Their terminology kept them protected, even as their deeds exposed the reality. For the clergy, the duplicated visits generated strain. Some pondered in intimate journals why the same flesh needed so much correction. Others concerned that women were becoming reliant on the ceremonies, employing them not for recovery, but for satisfaction. Yet these uncertainties were seldom voiced vocally. To question too publicly would mean weakening the very power of the church and its instructions. Quiet once more shielded the method, even as doubt intensified. If we consider this in current language, it would be like patients emerging again and again for a treatment that physicians questioned. Yet, physicians persisted anyway, because halting would expose the frailty of their techniques. Communities started to observe as well. In areas with functioning convents, it was murmured that some women visited far too frequently. Neighbours wondered about what attracted them back, though the ceremonies themselves stayed concealed behind shut doors. The privacy only increased the interest, making the procedure appear even more powerful. The more women emerged, the more powerful the standing of the method became. What was previously questioned became accepted, embraced as part of existence in towns and villages. The pattern had results. Beyond the barriers of the convent, women held with them both the relief of the ceremony and the privacy that encircled it. They promoted others quietly, proposing that it assisted with restlessness, worry, or unmentioned troubles. In this way, the method dispersed through spoken exchange, though no formal documents or instructions recognised its actual results. Awareness moved in whispers, strengthening the notion that women had uncovered something valuable, though prohibited to label it. Clergy confronted the paradox of advancing a procedure they couldn't completely clarify. They comforted households that the ceremonies functioned, yet privately concerned about the persistent returns. Some started to force limitations, informing women they couldn't arrive too frequently or that they faced dependency to the method. But these cautions did little to reduce the requirement. The relief women experienced exceeded the dishonour, and they emerged whenever their discomfort became too substantial. The continuation of this sequence reveals both strength and desperation. Women were prepared to bear privacy, remorse, and even the possibility of doubt in order to recover a small portion of ease. They reshaped the vocabulary they had access to, disguising their desires as sickness, allowing them to safely ask for additional treatments. This silent demonstration of will, though concealed, shows how women created pathways to work within structures designed to suppress them. I cannot help but recognize in their continuous visits a deliberate form of defiance, a method of seizing authority over their own flesh, even inside a framework that stripped them of language. The recurrence of these ceremonies also transformed their perception. What started as remarkable incidents connected to divine combat became commonplace happenings. Women's shaking and fainting were no longer surprising, but anticipated, even standard. The remarkable had been made routine, establishing a culture where constant surrender was embedded into everyday existence. This routinization further obscured the boundary between treatment and domination, making it even more difficult to challenge. By the late medieval era, these behaviours were firmly established. Religious houses kept providing treatments, women kept coming back, and clergy kept wrestling with uncertainties they seldom expressed. The quiet maintained the structure, but underneath it, fractures had started to appear. Some religious men acknowledged the inconsistency, observing in their diaries that the ongoing nature of affliction might suggest the remedy was no remedy whatsoever. Their uncertainties, though, stayed hidden, eclipsed by the weight of custom and the expectations of households who insisted on answers. The account of women visiting repeatedly for ceremonies of purification shows both the boundaries of medieval healing and the concealed strength of female determination. It demonstrates how women discovered methods to pursue comfort within brutal structures and how those structures shifted under the pressure of their constant appeals. This pattern of recurrence laid the foundation for a growing discomfort among clergy. Some started to document carefully about the risks of excessive reliance, cautioning that women might grow too familiar with treatments intended to be infrequent. Their reluctance signalled the start of another phase, one where mistrust of the ceremonies themselves started to infiltrate the very organisations that had established them. Some clergy started to maintain discreet records in their personal diaries, brief observations that showed more uncertainty than conviction. They portrayed the peculiar circumstance that what was labelled treatment appeared to function. Yet they possessed no reasoning for why the spasms and shaking of the women concluded in tranquillity instead of turmoil. These observations were never spoken aloud in communal gatherings. They stayed concealed in compartments or secured inside timber containers, because confessing uncertainty before others was too risky. But within those yellowed traces of ink, there was an admission. The ceremonies were successful in manners the clergy did not comprehend, and this troubled them deeply. With time, the clergy observed that women visited repeatedly, frequently with the same unclear expressions of burden or disquiet. Initially, these returns were regarded as typical. A woman might be likened to land that needed consistent cultivation, so their bodies were simply seen as containers requiring upkeep. Yet after months of repetition, some clergy started to label it a concern. They employed terms like routine or even dependence, as if women were pursuing gratification rather than restoration. The description changed and the worry intensified. Limitations were gradually implemented. Some clergy instructed women not to return too regularly, cautioning them that excessive exposure to these ceremonies would compromise their spirits. Others documented that they would no longer assist women who requested too frequently, worrying that the practice had become tainted. This was not purely a question of virtue. It was also grounded in anxiety. If too many women uncovered the feelings for themselves, the dominance of the clergy would be reduced. The practice of restoration would surrender its enigma, transforming instead into a route to individual consciousness. This was a delicate equilibrium. On one side was the portrayal of sacred authority reviving women through holy interaction. On the other side was the expanding awareness that these outcomes originated from the flesh itself, not from devotions or sacred objects. The clergy did not wish to acknowledge that their contact, their opportunity, and their ceremonies might only be masks for something innate. That acknowledgement would dismantle centuries of dominance. It is nearly absurd to picture holy men documenting nervously about women returning too frequently, as if the true transgression was arranging too many sessions. They appeared more troubled about surrendering their dominance than about comprehending what was genuinely occurring. Each visit became a signal that the Church could not completely control what it had attempted to designate as affliction. The strain exposed the boundaries of their structure. The clergy could prohibit repeat visits, but they could not eliminate the recollection of what women had experienced once encountered. The feelings remained in the flesh, even if wrapped in disgrace. The women might not discuss openly, but they understood. Some may have begun to murmur among themselves, discreetly questioning why such tranquility could be declared wicked. Others probably bore the contradiction silently, divided between comfort and remorse. In contemporary society, this contradiction might resemble patients being cautioned not to overuse medications simply because it performed too effectively. It is like a physician instructing someone not to consume their pain management regularly, not because it damages them, but because it threatens the physician's feeling of authority. The ridiculousness becomes apparent when examined through a contemporary perspective. The alleged protectors of wellness were more preoccupied with dominance than with compassion. The diaries that remain tell us less about women's realities than about men's anxieties. The documentation is saturated with concern about overindulgence, degradation, and enticement. The flesh of the woman was regarded as a location of peril, where restoration could transition too readily into transgression. Yet concealed beneath these worried words is proof that the clergy acknowledged the reality. They witnessed that women discovered solace, even pleasure, in these ceremonies. And they understood that this reality was shaky terrain for their authority. I cannot help but sense that these hidden uncertainties, etched into parchment by anxious hands, were the nearest the clergy approached to confessing they did not grasp the female flesh whatsoever. Examining them now, it is challenging not to detect the contradiction. They worried about revelation, but the very practice of documenting their worries kept them for future generations to reveal. Women, naturally, kept attending when they could. Though some were rejected, others pursued assistance in less structured settings, locating midwives or community healers who were not restricted by religious regulations. In this manner, the authority of the clergy started to deteriorate. The ceremonies no longer existed only to the Church. They were moving into households whispered between women, transformed by those who ventured to touch without authorization from holy men. The clergy attempted to strengthen their hold, discussing more severely about virtue and enticement. But the inconsistency was already apparent. The ceremonies they had supported as restoration could not readily be labelled wicked. When they generated comfort, each denial only increased the interest of the women who had already witnessed the outcomes. Restriction became its own promotion. The outcome was an uncomfortable quiet. Clergy discouraged regular visits. Women concealed their understanding, and the practice persisted under darkness. The strain between suppression and recurrence established a fragile structure of authority. It was not maintainable, but for a period it permitted both sides to keep pretending. The clergy could still identify themselves as healers. The women could still pursue comfort, even if they had to disguise it as affliction. The account of these uncertainties reveals something deeper about the Middle Ages. It was not solely about lack of knowledge or superstition, it was also about authority and the anxiety of surrendering it. The clergy might have prayed for direction, but what they worried about most was not malevolent spirits. It was the likelihood that women would acknowledge their own capability for restoration and no longer require the church. The documents left behind are delicate strands, but they disclose enough to grasp the conflict. They demonstrate that even within the boundaries of dominance, there were fractures of uncertainty. They remind us that authority was never complete, and that understanding, once experienced in the body, could not readily be removed. The clergy attempted to label it dependence, but the reality was more straightforward. Women had discovered a source of power disguised as affliction, and that revelation, more than any affliction, was what endangered the dominance of the church. The clergy may have quieted their congregations, but their own writing exposed them. The practice of documenting their anxieties preserved the very understanding they desired to conceal. In their effort to contain the enigma, they revealed it. The account of their uncertainty is a signal that even the most inflexible structures are delicate when faced with the resilience of the flesh. The women who visited repeatedly were not sick in soul. They were discovering something dangerous, that their bodies held their own responses, whether or not the church accepted. The clergy who once declared certainty concluded by challenging their own practices, revealing the fractures in their dominance. Their uncertainties, though concealed, showed that restoration could not be managed as firmly as they envisioned. And from these fractures, new forms of understanding started to circulate, establishing the foundation for women to pursue other methods of care that no clergy could completely control. Away from the massive stone barriers of churches and the murmured directions of clergy, a more subdued network started to expand. It was not structured through volumes or formal proclamations, but through the everyday realities of women who devoted their time caring for households, helping with childbirth, and supporting one another. These women, identified as midwives or simply reliable neighbours, started to acknowledge that they did not require a cleric standing over them to deliver comfort. They began to exchange methods among themselves, modest gestures and deliberate touches that brought ease to the flesh. The vocabulary they employed was intentionally unclear. Instead of identifying the practice, they discussed assisting, releasing, or creating equilibrium. Their vocabulary was designed to shield them from doubt, but their behaviours communicated a stronger reality. Women could direct one another through what the church labelled affliction without requiring authorization. This practice was not daring or defiant in the obvious manner. It was subdued, realistic, and founded in endurance. Women who had delivered children numerous times understood the pains and strains of the flesh. They recognized what soothed suffering, what relaxed muscles, and what permitted rest after days of weariness. They exchanged these things cautiously, sometimes during childbirth, sometimes during the peaceful hours of the evening. In these instances, understanding transferred from hand to hand, generation to generation, like a private inheritance. The church portrayed women as inactive containers, incapable of comprehending their own bodies. Yet here was evidence to the opposite. By acknowledging patterns and retaining what succeeded, these women were establishing a kind of concealed knowledge. They may not have documented writings or conducted trials, but their shared memory functioned as a reference. Comfort did not always demand prayers, sacred objects, or fragrance. It demanded confidence, contact, and the readiness to accept that ease was achievable without external dominance. It's both sorrowful and entertaining to picture clergy worrying about theology while women in kitchens and chambers discreetly resolved problems they never could. These practices of mutual care challenged the complex structures of ceremony and secrecy that the church had constructed. By maintaining their vocabulary unclear, women maintained themselves secure. But the understanding itself strengthened with each transaction. There was no singular designation for what they performed. Sometimes it was portrayed as equilibrating the womb, sometimes as calming the soul, and sometimes as simply assisting. The refusal to identify it directly was more than prudence. It also represented how risky identification could be. Once something possessed a definite word, it could be attacked by regulation, criticised by sermons, or destroyed in volumes. By leaving it unspecified, the practice evaded the traps of dominance, became a shifting, living custom that could not readily be captured. In a contemporary sense, this might compare to small mutual groups where people exchange wellness advice outside the watch of established medicine. It is like neighbours exchanging remedies while physicians debate over restrictions. And sometimes those household remedies are the ones that genuinely reduce suffering. In the Middle Ages, when established structures refused women independence, such transactions carried even heavier significance. For the women participating, the outcomes mattered more than reasoning. They did not require to understand why muscles loosened or why slumber came more readily afterward. They only required to experience the contrast between strain and ease, between unrest and tranquility. That sensation communicated for itself, and it became a form of understanding as genuine as any scripture. I find it extraordinary that in these concealed spaces, women were discreetly recovering a part of themselves that had been refused by dominance. They were not making declarations or documenting volumes, but they were constructing confidence in their own capacity to handle the flesh. It was a refined but significant transformation, the initial traces of self-consciousness that would subsequently develop into wider challenges to authority. Midwives particularly became essential figures in this network. Their labour already positioned them at the centre of women's realities. They helped in childbirth, supported mothers following, and were relied upon with personal matters. Through this position, they naturally became keepers of methods for ease. They understood where to apply pressure, how to knead, and how to utilise herbs in manners that calmed the flesh. These approaches might not have been characterised as sexual, yet they frequently produced responses the Church designated wicked. Still, the women relied upon their midwives more than clergy because the outcomes were undeniable. The understanding circulated discreetly, but it circulated extensively. Farmers' wives in settlements, merchant women in communities, even the attendants in aristocratic households. Each acquired fragments of the practice and transmitted it onward. It was never consistent, never regulated, but always rooted in mutual confidence. The secrecy shielded it, and the absence of organisation enabled it to endure. Where established teachings attempted to enforce structure, this underground network flourished precisely because it remained unspoken. This concealed practice also brought a danger. If uncovered, women could be charged with impropriety, sorcery, or worse. The absence of vocabulary that specified their practices maintained them safer, but it also meant they had to navigate a precarious line between care and peril. A thoughtless remark, an observation by the incorrect individual, could transform ease into proof of transgression. Still, the women persisted. Their devotion to one another exceeded their anxiety. The existence of this subdued rebellion within everyday reality challenges the manner history is frequently recalled. It was not solely clergy and monarchs forming circumstances. Common women, through common practices, were reshaping their connection to the flesh. They were establishing small territories of independence in a society that attempted to refuse them any. These transactions did not overthrow the structure, but they cultivated traces of uncertainty and expectation. For every woman who witnessed ease at the hands of another woman, the assertion that only clergy could restore became less persuasive. The authority of the Church was not complete, and the flesh itself expressed its own realities. By the period these practices became more apparent in subsequent centuries, they were already profoundly established in everyday reality. The midwives and their subdued assistants had constructed a foundation of confidence that persisted through generations. What started as murmured gestures became the earliest movements of self-acknowledgement, a refined rebellion presented as common care. Women uncovered that they could provide each other ease even without the direction of clergy. and this subdued support became its own form of power. Their whispered practices constituted the earlier movements toward comprehending their bodies beyond the grasp of dominance. Yet as this concealed network expanded, the Church started to detect a danger, preparing to retaliate at those who ventured to restore outside its authority. In the fields and dwellings of medieval settlements, understanding moved differently than in communities or religious houses. It did not transfer through volumes or sermons, but through the verbal word transmitted in the voices of women who laboured side by side. These were the wives of farmers, women who cared for animals, transported water and supervised households while their husbands toiled in the fields. They exchanged their secrets during extended evenings by the fire while spinning wool or preparing food in the peaceful rhythms of everyday reality. Among these secrets was a method spoken of only in murmurs, the deliberate crossing of hands beneath the belly, a motion intended to reduce discomfort when the flesh felt heavy or restless. It was not impressive, it was not communal, but it circulated rapidly. The method was straightforward. A woman would position her hand or request another to apply pressure across the lower abdomen, moving in a manner that released strain. Sometimes herbs were massaged into the skin beforehand, their warmth contributing to the result. Other times, the motion itself was sufficient. Comfort frequently followed, the kind of comfort that enabled slumber to arrive readily or calmed suffering that had persisted for days. The women did not characterize it as medicine or as transgression. They simply labeled it assistance. Accounts of achievement gave the practice reliability. One wife might mention that after her neighbour's direction, she had slumbered through the night for the first time in weeks. Another might speak of how her disposition improved after days of melancholy. These reports transferred quickly through the community. Without volumes to document them, they existed in recollection and repetition, becoming more powerful with every recounting. The practice expanded not through formal approval, but through confidence, the kind of confidence that women offered to one another in hidden settings. It is nearly ridiculous to consider that educated men devoted years documenting dense writings on the mysteries of the womb, while women in modest dwellings resolved their discomfort with a few strategically positioned hands. The difference is pronounced. While scholars debated theology and doctors argued about wandering wombs, women were quietly healing each other with methods that genuinely worked. The hidden nature of these practices gave them strength. By refusing to write them down, women made sure no one could easily condemn what they did. Secrecy became their armour. The simple act of sharing knowledge through whispers and stories created a barrier. There were no documents to burn, no official records to destroy, because nothing was ever written. What lasted was memory itself, something no priest could take away. Oral tradition moved faster than any manuscript ever could. A book might require months or years to copy by hand, and only a select few had the ability to read it. A story, however, could travel from home to home in just one night. It was like comparing a handwritten letter sent by horse to the instant messages we send today. These spoken stories were the medieval equivalent of rapid communication. Once a method was shared aloud, it travelled with incredible speed. Free from the constraints of literacy, women held on to this knowledge, not just because it helped them, but because it was theirs. In a world where others so often defined their bodies, this was something they commanded. They decided when to share it, how much to disclose, and who deserved their trust. These decisions forged a bond more powerful than any rules handed down from authority. It was sisterhood forged out of survival. I find it powerful that through these exchanges, women weren't just easing pain, they were also creating quiet networks of support. Their whispers meant more than just remedies. They were confirmations that they weren't alone, that someone else knew what they were going through. This human bond mattered just as much as physical comfort. The circulation of this knowledge also exposed the distance between village life and official medicine. Priests and doctors seldom visited rural areas, and when they showed up, their solutions were often impractical or cruel. Women couldn't pay for expensive treatments or risk being humiliated. Instead, they turned to each other, transforming everyday conversations into survival networks for health. The secrecy wasn't just about dodging criticism, it was also about preserving dignity. Women discussed their bodies carefully, protecting themselves from mockery. Their language was full of indirect references, avoiding explicit terms but leaving no confusion for those who listened closely. The lack of precise vocabulary didn't diminish the knowledge. Actually, it strengthened it because the stories could adjust to each listener, weaving into the patterns of their daily lives. For many, this knowledge became woven into household wisdom, handed down like recipes or weaving techniques a mother would teach her daughter, who would then pass it to her friends after marriage. This way, the practice became embedded in the culture, invisible to those searching for it officially, yet flourishing just below the surface. The threat, naturally, was always lurking. If a man overheard too much, or a priest became curious, whispers could transform into accusations. Women could face charges of superstition or something worse. This danger added gravity to their secrecy. They weren't simply sharing advice, they were protecting something fragile against a world ready to destroy it. Yet in spite of the dangers, the knowledge continued to spread. By trusting each other, women discovered ways to maintain control over their own well-being. They demonstrated that resilience didn't always require open defiance. Sometimes it emerged from the quiet persistence of memory, passed from mouth to mouth, resisting the silence forced upon them by those in power. This story of peasant women reveals how history isn't only shaped by kings and priests, but also by the countless unnamed women who supported each other through hardship with nothing but words and trust. Their role might be absent from official records, but it was essential for survival. Without their whispered remedies, many would have suffered in silence. Instead, they discovered relief, even if they had to conceal it. In the broader sweep of history, these whispers hold significance. They represent the early stirrings of self-awareness, the initial recognition that women's bodies belong to them. Each story shared was an act of quiet defiance, making sure that knowledge survived oppression. Village women preserved their remedies not through books, but through voices, weaving a network of shared care that no authority could completely eliminate. Their whispered conversations provided both relief and solidarity, proving that silence could conceal strength as much as fear. Yet as this hidden network grew more visible through its results, those who governed through doctrine started looking for ways to crush it, transforming whispers into objects of suspicion. As the whispers among women became more noticeable in their impact, the church started paying attention. What had seemed like innocent household customs soon came to be seen as challenges to power. Priests and bishops didn't see healing touch or gentle treatments. They saw women crossing boundaries that had been established for them, claiming a type of care that circumvented the sacred structure of ritual. This was unacceptable in a system that insisted control over the female body belonged to men and to God, never to the women themselves. The Church reacted in the only manner it understood, with stricter regulations, harsher preaching, and more severe punishments. The tone of sermons grew intense. Priests declared that women who cared for each other outside holy supervision were meddling with sin. They accused them of inviting demons, of compromising their souls by depending on each other rather than the sacraments. The term purity was invoked constantly, but in reality it meant submission. Women were informed that if they pursued relief outside the church, they were corrupting not just themselves, but their entire families. Fear served as the tool used to force them back into obedience. Confession turned into another instrument of control. Women suspected of self-care were pushed to confess their alleged sins. Confessors posed leading questions, hunting for evidence of wrongdoing, even when none could be found. A woman who acknowledged anything, even vague acts of self-comfort, could face punishment through penance, public humiliation, or community exclusion. The system was designed less to save the soul and more to consolidate power. It's almost darkly comic to consider that relieving a stomachache could place a woman in the same category as a heretic. But for the Church, the real transgression was autonomy, not the action itself. Some women encountered harsher consequences if they resisted confession, or, if rumours spread too widely, they could be brought to trial. Charges of witchcraft or moral decay filled the air, and even if they weren't executed, they could be driven from their homes and villages. This punishment was particularly brutal in a world where survival relied on community connections. Being cast out was frequently worse than any bodily pain. The Church presented these actions as a spiritual imperative. Officials claimed that without firm boundaries, society would descend into anarchy. They insisted that only male-supervised rituals could purify the soul and the body. Yet what they truly feared was losing their monopoly over care. The women's methods were successful enough to draw attention, and that success was threatening. It implied that women could manage without clerical authority. In some instances, officials even targeted midwives, accusing them of inappropriate practices. These women, once respected figures in their villages, became targets. Their understanding of herbs and massage, once valued, was recast as questionable. A healer could swiftly be turned into a menace, not because she injured anyone, but because she dared to function without male supervision. It was like modern regulators closing down neighbourhood clinics, not because they harmed patients, but because they competed with larger, more dominant institutions. Control was the actual goal, wrapped in the rhetoric of morality. The fear circulated among women, but so did bitterness. Many must have questioned why something that brought peace and comfort could be labelled evil. They complied outwardly, but inwardly they harboured doubts. These doubts were risky, but they were also seeds of transformation. The more women witnessed the gap between their actual reality and the Church's proclamations, the more difficult it became to silence them entirely. I find it profoundly striking that what the Church feared most wasn't sin itself, but the prospect of women discovering that their bodies weren't mysteries after all. This exposes the unstable foundation of its authority. Genuine faith shouldn't fear knowledge, yet the Church feared even the smallest revelation. It shows us that the balance of power was never as secure as it pretended to be. Despite the punishments, women didn't stop completely. Some became more careful, concealing their practices more thoroughly. Others shared their knowledge only within the tightest circles of trust. The rituals may have grown quieter, but they didn't disappear. The need for comfort was too powerful, and the connection between women too lasting to be eliminated by threats alone. The Church's crackdown exposes a contradiction. By responding so aggressively, it confirmed that these practices had genuine effect. If they were worthless, there would have been no reason for punishment. The very act of suppression demonstrated the worth of what women were doing. This contradiction didn't escape notice. Even in silence, women must have grasped the irony. Villages adjusted. Women continued exchanging knowledge, but they did so under multiple layers of secrecy. Movements became more discreet, language more veiled. They disguised their remedies as routine household activities. A hand placed on the belly might appear as nothing more than comfort. Herbs might be described as seasoning instead of medicine. The boundary between everyday life and secret healing became unclear, making it more challenging for authorities to identify. The suppression of women's healing fits into a broader pattern that repeats through history. Those with power often attack not what is harmful but what is self-sufficient. By controlling access to health and knowledge, they keep populations reliant and compliant. The medieval Church was no different. Its campaign to eliminate self-care among women was less about protecting souls and more about maintaining dominance. And yet, despite all the effort, the crackdown couldn't erase what women had already discovered. Once a woman understood that relief was achievable, she retained that memory, even if she had to hide it. Beneath layers of shame, knowledge might be silenced, but it's rarely obliterated. It persists, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. The crackdown by the church transformed whispered acts of comfort into offences, demonstrating just how tenuous its control really was. Women withdrew into secrecy, but their knowledge survived in ways no punishment could fully destroy. From this conflict emerged even bolder challenges, where hidden books and forbidden healers would confront flames in the name of purity. Throughout medieval Europe, knowledge was never secure when it clashed with authority. The church had already strengthened its control over women's bodies by crushing whispered practices, but written records were perceived as an even greater threat. Unlike oral traditions, books and manuscripts couldn't be easily dismissed or altered. They possessed permanence, a substance that could outlive sermons. Some texts, frequently written by female healers or by male physicians willing to document what they had witnessed, contained descriptions of techniques for massage, fumigation, or herbal treatment of the womb. To the church, these writings violated a boundary. They provided visible form to knowledge that was meant to stay hidden. The charge most frequently thrown at these works was vulgarity. Any discussion of the female body outside the vocabulary of purity was branded obscene. Words describing physical contact, even when written clinically, were viewed as dangerous to clerics. They weren't medicine, but temptation. Books that documented women's experiences or remedies became suspect objects, their very existence threatening to unravel carefully built boundaries. Fire became the answer. Burnings of such texts occurred both publicly and privately. In some towns, books were seized and destroyed in the presence of witnesses, turning the event into a lesson. People were told they were witnessing sin being consumed by flame. In other instances, manuscripts were taken quietly, vanishing into church fires without ceremony. The outcome was identical: erasure. The official narrative was maintained, while alternative knowledge was literally reduced to ash. Women who created or safeguarded these works faced serious dangers. A midwife with a collection of notes could be charged with witchcraft. Her familiarity with the female body was reinterpreted as a pact with evil. Herbalists who explained the use of plants for easing pain were rebranded as destroyers of purity. Punishments ranged widely: fines, banishment, or, in the most severe cases, execution. But even when lives were saved, reputations were ruined. The knowledge itself, once captured in ink, was treated as proof of guilt. It's almost ridiculous to picture men in robes panicking over a few lines of text about abdominal massage, as if parchment possessed the power to collapse kingdoms. Yet that fear exposes the truth. They understood how fragile their authority was when confronted with written evidence that women could care for one another. The destruction of these texts wasn't only about morality, it was about controlling history. By removing alternative records, the church guaranteed that the story of medicine would be narrated through its own perspective. Future generations would read only what had been sanctioned, never learning what had been destroyed. Entire traditions of female healing, carefully observed and transmitted, vanished without a trace. What remained was a distorted image, shaped by those who had no direct knowledge of the womb they claimed to govern. In contemporary terms, this mirrors the suppression of medical studies that threaten powerful industries. It would be like destroying research on safe treatments simply because it challenged profitable but harmful practices. The pattern is recognizable. Eliminate what threatens authority, even if it saves lives. Replace it with doctrine, even if doctrine causes suffering. I find it deeply troubling that entire generations of women were denied access to knowledge simply because it was written down. Oral traditions could slip through, but once words appeared on a page, they became a target. The destruction wasn't random. It was a calculated rewriting of history, a method of ensuring that women remained ignorant of their own bodies. Yet even facing suppression, fragments endured. A few manuscripts tucked away in monasteries or private collections carried echoes of what had been erased. Scholars, centuries later, would discover these traces, reconstructing the reality of female healing traditions. The survival of even a handful of texts demonstrates how resilient the hunger for knowledge truly was. But compared to what was lost, these remnants are merely shadows. The persecution of women healers exposes the hypocrisy of the era. While priests condemned massage or fumigation as indecent, they themselves continued practices that mirrored them in veiled rituals. The difference wasn't in the action, but in who controlled it. When men performed it under the church's name, it was sacred. When women did so among themselves, it was witchcraft. This double standard maintained authority at the expense of truth. Communities experienced the loss as well. Women who had once depended on local healers found themselves without trusted figures. Some returned to priests, submitting to treatments that were more about ritual than relief. Others persisted in secret, but the fear of discovery made their work more difficult. What had once been shared openly within households was now weighted with suspicion. Every action risked accusation. The burning of books was also symbolic. It delivered a clear message. Women were not supposed to be authors of their own history. Their voices, when written, would be silenced. The physical act of fire-consuming parchment reinforced the notion that female knowledge was dangerous, unholy, and disposable. It was a spectacle designed to teach obedience. Despite the destruction, the memory of what had been lost remained in the minds of those who had witnessed or heard of the texts. Stories of women accused, of manuscripts seized, were passed along like warnings. These stories ensured that even if the precise content of the books was gone, the sense of injustice persisted. The women who experienced these events carried the burden of both fear and resistance. The long-term consequences were severe. Generations matured without access to medical traditions that might have relieved their suffering. Instead, they were left with superstition disguised as doctrine. The erasure of texts meant that when later physicians began to write new medical works, they constructed them on incomplete foundations. The gap was intentional, engineered by those who valued power over truth. In the end, the flames consumed more than parchment. They consumed trust, silencing voices that could have transformed how women understood themselves. The church may have believed it was preserving purity, but what it truly preserved was ignorance. That ignorance became the legacy inherited through centuries. The destruction of these healing texts left women with silence instead of knowledge, replacing potential understanding with fear. Communities were stripped of voices that might have guided them, and history itself was rewritten to erase their contributions. From those ashes, a new approach emerged, steering women toward marriage as the proper remedy for all their problems. When the flames had silenced the books and punishments had driven midwives into shadows, the church offered a simpler solution. Women, they declared, should marry. Marriage was presented as not just a duty, but also a cure. A husband, it was argued, would regulate the womb, stabilize the mind, and ensure that peculiar illnesses would disappear. The reasoning was obvious in the eyes of clerics. Women didn't need rituals or secret practices. They only needed a man. Sermons delivered this message with conviction. A young woman displaying signs of distress was told her issue wasn't medical, but marital. Priests counselled fathers to arrange marriages swiftly, reassuring them that a husband would keep their daughters healthy in both body and soul. The responsibility of treatment was transferred from the priest's hand to the husband's bed. In this manner, the church wove control of women's health into the framework of the household. The marriage cure wasn't merely a suggestion, it became an expectation. A woman who rejected marriage risked being labelled defiant or even ill. Her refusal was portrayed as dangerous, a rejection not just of family duty but of divine order. In communities already influenced by fear and suspicion, the pressure was crushing. The assumption underlying this cure was crude. A husband was thought to provide consistent sexual release, preventing the womb from wandering, or the mind from falling into melancholy. The act of sex itself was reframed as a therapeutic obligation, not for pleasure, but for order. The wife's role was to yield, believing that compliance would keep her body free of sickness. It's almost laughable to imagine priests proclaiming that the ultimate treatment for women's ailments was simply a wedding ring, as if vows could substitute for medicine. The reduction of complex physical and emotional experiences to the convenience of marriage reveals how little effort was invested in understanding women on their own terms. For many women, marriage brought no comfort. Instead, it added new dimensions of stress. Household duties, pregnancies, and the constant expectation of obedience often aggravated the very conditions it was meant to cure. But the Church seldom blamed marriage. If a woman continued to display signs of restlessness or sadness, the fault was said to rest with her. She was accused of weakness, of excessive desire, or of failing in her role as wife. The cruelty of this reasoning lay in its circular structure. Marriage was proclaimed the cure, and if the cure failed, the blame still landed on the patient. Women couldn't escape the system because every route led back to submission. Their bodies were interpreted through the framework of obedience, never through the reality of their own experiences. In modern terms, this isn't far from prescribing the same treatment for every condition, regardless of the symptoms. It would be like a doctor today telling every patient, no matter their illness, that the cure is to sign a contract with someone else. The absurdity highlights how little the system cared for individual health. The objective was not healing, but conformity. I can't help but think about how many women must have entered marriages believing they were stepping into treatment, only to discover themselves trapped in something far harsher. The betrayal must have been enormous, replacing hope with disillusionment and turning the promise of healing into a lifelong burden. Some women may have tried to rationalize it. They persuaded themselves that stability came from obedience, that their unease was a sign of weak faith rather than poor health. Others suffered silently, their conditions untreated, their questions ignored. The silence was sustained because breaking it risked shame. The household became another mechanism of control. Husbands, empowered by the notion that they were healers, saw their authority strengthened. The Church no longer needed to supervise every woman directly. Marriage extended its influence into every home, making the husband an agent of regulation. Women were told to be thankful, even when the cure brought more suffering than relief. For those without husbands, the situation was bleaker. Widows or unmarried women were often viewed as unstable by nature, their very independence portrayed as sickness. They faced suspicion, pity, or contempt, and were pressured to marry quickly or risk being ostracized. In this way, marriage was not just a cure, but also a command. Communities internalized these lessons. Families treated marriage as a form of protection, both spiritual and social. Fathers arranged unions not just to secure alliances, but to shield daughters from accusations of disorder. Mothers advised compliance, passing along the belief that health depended on submission. The cycle perpetuated, reinforced with each generation. And yet doubt persisted. Some women knew from experience that marriage didn't erase their unease. Others whispered of neighbours, who seemed no better off despite obedience. These doubts rarely became open challenges, but they simmered beneath the surface. The official story of marriage as a cure remained dominant, yet it was never fully persuasive. The Church didn't care that the cure was incomplete. It served its function by reinforcing male authority. In this sense, the marriage prescription was effective not as medicine but as control. It transformed private suffering into a public structure, binding women more tightly into roles from which escape was nearly impossible. What was sacrificed in this process was the possibility of genuine understanding. Women's bodies became instruments for maintaining social order rather than subjects of care. Their pain was redefined as rebellion, their pleasure as sin, and their healing as obedience. The truth of their experiences was replaced with doctrine. The marriage cure reveals how the line between health and morality was blurred beyond recognition. It demonstrates how an entire system could disguise domination as care, convincing generations of women that their bodies were illnesses waiting for men to fix. The belief that marriage itself could cure women's troubles turned personal lives into extensions of doctrine, trapping them in roles disguised as remedies. What appeared as care was really control, and those who suffered were blamed for their own pain. From this framework of obedience, the silence around women's bodies intensified, leaving young girls to mature in ignorance about themselves. Young women in the Middle Ages matured under layers of silence. Their bodies were mysteries they weren't supposed to comprehend, spoken of only in terms of sin, purity, or obedience. They were taught how to pray, how to serve, and how to obey, but not how to interpret the signals of their own flesh. Pain was something to be tolerated. Fear was something to be accepted, and any stirrings of pleasure were branded as dangerous intrusions. In this environment, ignorance wasn't an accident. It was deliberately maintained as a method of control. The education of girls rarely contained anything about their health. A daughter might be taught to cook, sew, or care for livestock, but nothing about menstruation beyond whispered warnings to stay clean. If she posed questions, she was often scolded or silenced. Mothers themselves, raised in ignorance, had little more to provide than cautions to endure. Fathers never discussed such matters, and priests only framed the female body as a source of temptation. The outcome was a cycle of silence where each generation repeated the same emptiness of knowledge. This ignorance had real consequences. When pain arrived, whether from monthly cycles, giving birth, or sickness, young women had no way to make sense of it. They thought they were damned, fragile, or haunted because those were the only explanations given to them. Even ordinary bodily functions were presented as dangers to virtue. The absence of information transformed every unfamiliar sensation into terror. It seems almost absurd that an entire structure determined the most effective method to control women was to leave them so uninformed that they confused their own nature with wickedness. Yet this absurdity formed the basis of domination. Information would have granted women authority, and authority was forbidden. Rather than discovering their bodies, young women were conditioned to dread them. Any hint of enjoyment was classified as disease. Any expression of discomfort was classified as frailty. This approach guaranteed that women absorbed shame from their youngest years. Their bodies turned into obstacles, not fonts of power. To challenge this meant challenging both household and religion, something few risked doing in comparison. Today, most communities at least attempt to provide children with fundamental health instruction. It resembles picturing a contemporary school erasing every anatomy class, forcing students to construct their knowledge from gossip and discipline. That was the existence for young women in medieval settlements. Gossip turned into their curriculum and discipline turned into their education. I cannot avoid feeling profound sorrow when I consider how many young women matured into adulthood, never understanding that their sensations were ordinary. Rather than receiving gentle guidance, they were abandoned to fumble in darkness, bearing shame that never belonged to them. This withholding of information was not merely harsh, but intentional. The quiet also preserved the dominance of men. Spouses, clergy, and healers could assert knowledge precisely because women were prevented from acquiring it themselves. If a wife did not understand what her body should experience, she could not question whether her circumstances were fair. If she did not comprehend her rhythms, she could not protest when told her reproductive organs were corrupt. This lack of knowledge guaranteed reliance. Mothers frequently wrestled with this situation. Some wished to share more with their daughters but dreaded the outcomes. To communicate frankly could bring charges of moral decay. Safer to stay silent, they believed, even if it meant witnessing their children's anguish. This quiet was transmitted as affection, but it was actually terror, and the price of shattering it appeared too steep. The church strengthened this at every opportunity. Sermons portrayed women as containers of seduction, able to cause destruction if not rigidly managed. This language made young women feel ashamed for merely inhabiting their own bodies, even before matrimony. They were schooled to perceive themselves as defective, requiring supervision and incapable of believing their own senses. Communities upheld this quiet. Rumours disciplined those who ventured to pose too many inquiries. A young woman inquisitive about her body could be ridiculed or isolated. Social force reinforced what sermons had already proclaimed. The boundary between virtue and lack of knowledge dissolved until they merged. Yet the human form does not remain quiet. Discomfort and enjoyment both require recognition, regardless of how strongly they are rejected. Young women who felt them in solitude must have borne tremendous bewilderment. Some sought older women for direction. But even then, the responses were frequently cloaked in unclear cautions. Explicit information was denied, creating voids that could never be satisfied. The absence of instruction also left women exposed to abuse. Religious officials and healers could declare expertise because women had no foundation to dispute them. A remedy might be odd or even damaging, but without information, women embraced it as essential. This pattern strengthened reliance, maintaining the order undisturbed. What arises from this quiet is not simply the lack of facts, but the existence of terror. Lack of knowledge turned into an instrument for controlling conduct. Women who did not understand their bodies were simpler to dominate, simpler to disgrace, and simpler to deceive. The lack of instruction was not carelessness. It was a deliberate approach. Across generations, this created a society where women were separated from themselves. Their sense of self was constructed on compliance rather than comprehension. The body, which ought to have been a foundation of strength, transformed into a persistent reminder of inadequacy. Only those with power could provide interpretations, and those interpretations always benefited their dominance. The misfortune of this structure is evident. Information that could have delivered comfort and assurance was purposefully withheld. Instead, women were conditioned to connect their bodies with terror, shame, and reliance. What was ordinary was labelled corrupt, and what was damaging was labelled sacred. The burden was carried by every young woman who matured thinking that her own flesh was unreliable. Young women were abandoned with quiet, where information should have existed, bearing shame for what was merely ordinary. Their lack of knowledge was meticulously maintained as protection for authority, guaranteeing reliance across generations. From this quiet, a threatening contradiction developed, where even instances of enjoyment were distorted into disciplines masquerading as sacred wisdom. The body possesses a method of exposing realities, even when language is prohibited. In medieval periods, women occasionally felt instances of profound relief during remedies, sensations that relaxed their muscles and rendered them peaceful. Yet nobody was permitted to clarify what had occurred. These reactions, now identifiable as climax, were wrapped in terminology that avoided identifying them. They were labelled cleansing, expelling, or spiritual release. Anything except what they truly were. For the women themselves, the instruction was obvious. If you experienced something agreeable, you must stay silent. Enjoyment was handled like an interloper. It was not to be recognised, much less honoured. A woman who appeared too content after a remedy faced distrust. If she raised inquiries, she was blamed for inquisitiveness that approached transgression. And if she attempted to communicate frankly, the repercussions could be harsh. Sermons cautioned that such sensations were deceptions of evil. admission could result in degradation. In certain instances, women were disciplined simply for observing their own reactions. It seems almost absurd to picture that a completely ordinary bodily reaction was handled as evidence of moral decay, as if women were culpable of being alive. But such was the framework of that era. By declining to identify climax, the authorities guaranteed that women stayed in bewilderment, unable to assert possession of their own sensations. The quiet was not simply forced from outside. Women absorbed it. They conditioned themselves to turn away from what they experienced, to handle their own sensations as disgraceful. Relief was instantly covered in shame. A body that revealed happiness transformed into a foundation of dread. Over time, this established an environment where women could not believe themselves. Their own flesh was viewed as testimony against them. In comparison, most communities today at least recognize sexual wellness, even if incompletely. It resembles picturing a world where physicians recommend remedies but prohibit patients from explaining their reactions, abandoning them to suffer in silence. The absurdity becomes obvious when contemporary standards are considered. Yet for centuries this was the actual existence of innumerable women. I find it distressing to consider how many women were abandoned in isolation, thinking they were solitary in their sensations. Rather than assistance or direction, they encountered warnings of discipline. What ought to have been an instance of comfort transformed into another cause to feel confined. The refusal to clarify climax fulfilled a function. By refusing it a label, the Church dominated the account. If women did not possess terminology for what they experienced, they could not construct inquiries. And without inquiries, they could not require responses. Language itself transformed into an obstacle to comprehension. This intentional ambiguity removed from women the capacity to interpret their own existence. Communities strengthened the quiet. Mothers, even if they suspected the reality, seldom informed their daughters. Neighbours evaded the topic, dreading that rumours could create distrust. The pattern of ignorance persisted, not because women did not observe, but because they were compelled into rejection to survive. They preserved secrets even from themselves. The burden of this rejection was substantial. Women who felt enjoyment frequently thought it was transgression disguised as relief. They approached admission burdened with shame, only to be instructed to pray more intensely or to resist temptation. Rather than discovering that their reactions were ordinary, they were persuaded that their souls were endangered. The bewilderment intensified with every remedy, every murmured caution, every unspoken reality. Authorities gained from this bewilderment. As long as women could not identify their sensations, they could not dispute the dominance of clergy or healers. Men remained the interpreters of female bodies, even when they themselves possessed limited comprehension. This disparity of information strengthened reliance. Some women, however, must have detected the inconsistency. They experienced relief, and yet were informed it was incorrect. They understood their own bodies more closely than clergy ever could. Murmurs of uncertainty likely spread, even if only in the most reliable groups. These small uncertainties, though delicate, were beginnings of defiance. The refusal to recognize climax also demonstrates how delicate the structure truly was. If it had been insignificant, there would have been no requirement for quiet. The reality that so much effort was invested denying it demonstrates how dangerous it was that the body itself challenged the dominance of the Church, offering sensations that could not be rationalized without danger. Over time, this quiet transformed into part of the society. Generations matured, never hearing the term, never discovering that their sensations were common. The lack of terminology transformed into a form of confinement. Women who might have drawn power from collective comprehension were instead abandoned, isolated, each thinking she was solitary. This is the brutality of rejection. It eliminates unity. By removing from women terminology, the structure prevented them from discovering each other. What ought to have been a connection transformed into a burden. carried separately in shame. The absence of clarification was not ignorance. It was an approach designed to maintain women separated and obedient. The contradiction is disturbing. The very remedies intended to repress women frequently awakened sensations they were prohibited from recognizing. Each instance of enjoyment was relabeled as evidence of inadequacy, guaranteeing that even happiness transformed into an instrument of domination. History recalls these silences not because they were ordinary, but because they were forced. The refusal to identify what women experienced abandoned them, confined in patterns of confusion, bearing shame for something that was merely ordinary. This ignorance was meticulously formed into a prison, guaranteeing compliance by refusing even the terminology to express their sensations. From that quiet arose a legacy so influential that it resonated across centuries, determining how women perceived themselves long after the Middle Ages had disappeared. The legacy of the Middle Ages did not merely vanish when the centuries shifted. The domination forced on women's bodies persisted long after cathedrals crumbled into decay and kingdoms altered their boundaries. Even as new sciences appeared, the same quiet continued. The female body was still discussed in concealed language, its sensations left unnamed or twisted by those who did not experience them. What had started as sermons and ceremonies transformed into traditions and practices, transmitted forward into new periods with different attire. But the same reasoning, the rejection of women's enjoyment, persisted in determining medicine. Healers in subsequent centuries frequently disregarded or rejected the topic completely, selecting to concentrate on male anatomy as the standard. When female sexuality was mentioned, it was through the same perspective of disorder and sickness. Relief was still connected to compliance, and departure was still marked as illness. The Middle Ages had sown beginnings of quiet so profoundly that even contemporary structures struggled to remove them. Women themselves bore the burden of this inheritance. Generations matured thinking that their bewilderment was their responsibility, that their bodies were undependable or damaged. Mothers seldom possessed the terminology to instruct their daughters, and so the pattern repeated. Quiet passed as decency, shame passed as virtue, and ignorance passed as safety. This legacy of denying information maintained women reliant even as society professed to advance forward. It seems almost amusing in a dark manner that for centuries physicians could chart the heavens with accuracy, yet still declared women's bodies were incomprehensible. The difference demonstrates how intentional the neglect was. Ignorance was not a mistake of history, but a choice made and maintained by those with power. The continuation of this quiet demonstrates the influence of cultural recollection. Even when regulations changed and churches diminished influence, the reverberations of medieval thinking remained. Women were discouraged from raising inquiries, rejected when they did, and reprimanded when they pursued comprehension. Their sensations were presented as secondary, their enjoyment erased from serious attention. The enigma of the female body transformed into less a scientific challenge than a useful justification. In contemporary periods, discussions about sexuality are more transparent, yet the remains of medieval quiet still persist. It resembles discovering that an old lock still hangs on a door, even after the structure around it has been reconstructed. The lock no longer has a genuine function, but its existence reminds us of the limitations that once characterized the area. That is what the Middle Ages abandoned. Not simply regulations, but the practices of quiet. I cannot avoid feeling both irritation and sorrow when I observe how long this inheritance persisted, extending its shadow over women who never knew its source. They existed in centuries, far separated from medieval sermons, yet the burden of those sermons still pressed against them. The past does not merely vanish. It persists in terminology, in society, and in the assumptions people construct without even understanding where they originated. For many women, the quiet transformed into self-uncertainty. They thought they were sick when they were merely human, They thought they were corrupt when they were merely alive. These distortions determined marriages, households, and entire communities. Enjoyment, which could have been a foundation of power, was reframed as threat. Recovery, which could have been mutual and encouraging, was transformed into compliance. The persistence of this quiet also reveals how challenging it is to forget. Once information is eliminated or prohibited, generations may exist without it, never understanding what was sacrificed. This is the deepest injury of repression, not simply the anguish of those who experienced it, but the ignorance transmitted to those who came after. Entire histories of female sensation were eliminated, abandoning only pieces for subsequent scholars to rebuild. Yet even within this bleak legacy, there were instances of strength. Women persisted in sharing what they could in murmurs and movements, maintaining alive threads of information that would someday resurface. Their quiet determination guaranteed that the quiet was never absolute. Though the Middle Ages attempted to eliminate their voices, those voices persisted in concealed ways, anticipating a period when they could be acknowledged again. The account of climax as a remedy in medieval periods is not simply about miscomprehension, it is about domination, quiet, and the rewriting of history to benefit authority. It demonstrates how ordinary sensations were transformed into instruments of power and how that distortion determined existence. Across centuries, the women who experienced it bore both the relief of their bodies and the shame forced on them, a contradiction that still resonates today. As history advanced forward, the quiet shifted but did not vanish. It discovered new forms in Victorian medicine, in cultural prohibitions, and in the persistent reluctance to handle female sexuality as deserving of examination. The medieval legacy extended far beyond its own period, determining not simply how women were viewed, but how they viewed themselves. The Middle Ages may appear distant, yet their influence is nearer than we recognise. Every time women are informed, their inquiries are unsuitable. Every time their sensations are rejected as exaggeration, the shadow of that old quiet reappears. What started in dark chambers illuminated by candles persists to flicker in contemporary areas, a reminder of how long domination can persist once it establishes hold. The reality is straightforward but influential. Women were never damaged. They were never damned, never inherently fragile, never undeserving of information. They were human beings bearing the same complexity as men, but refused the terminology to comprehend themselves. That refusal was the genuine illness, not the bodies they were compelled to question. The quiet of the Middle Ages transformed into a chain extending across centuries, binding women in ignorance and shame. What ought to have been identified as ordinary was handled as transgression, and the burden of that distortion determined entire communities today. Recalling this legacy is not simply about history, but about shattering the final reverberations of quiet that still persist. Thank you for listening so attentively to this long journey through forgotten history. May these accounts give you both contemplation and peace. Have a peaceful night and sleep well.